Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the foam-flecked, ale-soaked world of the Vikings, those legendary seafaring warriors who didn't just raid monasteries and explore distant shores, but also perfected the ancient art of getting absolutely, magnificently drunk. From the mead halls of Norway to the beer gardens of Denmark, their story is one of incredible stamina, questionable decision-making, and drinking customs that would make even the most seasoned college fraternity pause and reconsider. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Vikings, you might imagine fierce warriors with horned helmets charging across stormy seas, axes gleaming in the pale northern light. But strip away the Hollywood drama, and you'll find something far more interesting. A people whose entire social fabric was woven around the simple, sacred act of drinking together. For the Vikings, alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was currency, medicine, religious sacrament, and social glue, all rolled into one frothy, intoxicating package. Their drinking wasn't casual weekend, partying it was an art form, a survival strategy, and sometimes a spectacularly messy way to end a perfectly good evening. Tonight, we'll explore how these northern warriors turned getting drunk into a cultural institution that shaped everything from their poetry to their politics, one horn of mead at a time. If you think your local craft brewery takes their beer seriously, the Vikings would like a word. These seafaring warriors didn't just stumble into taverns after a long day of pillaging. They built their entire civilization around the sacred art of getting properly, ceremoniously, religiously drunk. But here's where Hollywood gets it spectacularly wrong. Vikings weren't chugging tankards of foamy beer while belting out drinking songs. Their relationship with alcohol was far more complex, ritualistic, and frankly, a lot more interesting than any movie has ever suggested. They were connoisseurs, not college freshmen. The Viking approach to drinking was like everything else they did, methodical, hierarchical, and deeply woven into their understanding of the cosmos. What they drank, when they drank it, and how they drank it, revealed everything about their social status, their spiritual beliefs, and their place in the grand pecking order of Norse society. It was a liquid language that spoke of honor, allegiance, and divine favor, one sip at a time. At the apex of this alcoholic pyramid sat mead, the golden nectar that supposedly flowed like rivers through the halls of Asgard. If Vikings had a champagne, mead was it, except infinitely more sacred and significantly more likely to get you into a blood feud if you spilled it on someone important. Mead wasn't just honey wine. It was the drink of gods, jarls, and anyone else important enough to afford the luxury of sweetness in a world where sugar was rarer than dragon teeth. The creation of mead was an art form that required patience, skill, and access to one precious ingredient, honey. In medieval Scandinavia, honey was liquid gold, quite literally. Wild bees produced it in quantities that made every drop valuable, and harvesting it required either tremendous courage or tremendous stupidity, often both. Viking beekeepers, or more accurately, wild honey raiders, would brave swarms of angry bees to extract honeycombs from cliff faces and hollow trees. One can only imagine the irony of surviving a Viking raid only to be defeated by a bee sting. The process of making mead was deceptively simple, but demanded the kind of precision that Vikings typically reserved for navigation and weapon making. Honey was mixed with water in carefully calculated proportions. Too little honey, and you'd get weak, disappointing swill. Too much, and you'd create a syrupy mess that would ferment into something closer to alcoholic candy than a proper drink. The mixture was then left to ferment, sometimes for months, while wild yeasts worked their mysterious magic. Vikings understood fermentation about as well as they understood electricity, which is to say not at all, but they knew it worked, and they respected the process accordingly. What emerged from this patient alchemy was liquid ambition. Good mead had the potency of strong wine, but with a smoothness that could seduce even the most cautious drinker into overindulgence. It gleamed like amber in the firelight, carried the scent of summer meadows, and packed enough alcohol to make even seasoned warriors reconsider their life choices by morning. The best mead was aged for years, developing complexity that rivaled the finest wines of the Mediterranean. Vikings might not have had sommelier, but they certainly had opinions. Mead's status went far beyond its taste. In Norse mythology, the mead of poetry was a divine brew that granted wisdom and eloquence to anyone who drank it. The god Odin himself had stolen this sacred mead from the giants, transforming into an eagle to escape with the precious liquid. When Vikings raised horns of mead in their halls, they weren't just toasting, they were participating in a cosmic ritual that connected them to the gods themselves. Every sip was a prayer, every drink a communion with the divine. The social hierarchy around mead was rigid and unforgiving. The finest mead was reserved for jarls, kings, and honored guests. A Viking lord who served inferior mead to important visitors might as well have issued a formal insult. The quality and quantity of mead offered spoke volumes about both the host's wealth and their respect for their guests. Offering weak mead was like showing up to a business meeting in pajamas, technically possible, but unlikely to advance your career. But mead had a darker side that Vikings understood all too well. Its sweetness masked its potency, leading to countless tales of warriors who started the evening reciting poetry and ended it face down in the rushes. Unlike ale, which announced its strength with bitter honesty, mead seduced drinkers into overconfidence. Many a Viking alliance has been forged over mead, and just as many have been shattered when the honeyed wine loosened tongues a bit too much. If mead was the champagne of the Viking world, ale was the coffee essential, daily, and absolutely non-negotiable. While mead flowed at special occasions and religious ceremonies, ale was the liquid backbone of everyday life. Vikings drank ale at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and any other time they felt like it, which was most of the time. In a world where water quality was questionable at best and deadly at worst, ale wasn't just refreshment, it was survival with a pleasant buzz. The beauty of ale lay in its democratic accessibility. While mead required precious honey and months of careful aging, ale could be brewed from barley, oats, rye, or whatever grains happened to survive the harsh Scandinavian growing season. It was the people's drink, flowing as freely in peasant hovels as in royal halls, though the quality varied dramatically depending on the brewer's skill and ingredient budget. Viking ale was a far cry from the crisp, filtered beers that stock modern refrigerators. It was cloudy, thick, and possessed what we might charitably call character. The brewing process was rustic, at best grains, were malted, mashed, boiled with whatever herbs were available for flavoring, then left to ferment in wooden vats that had seen better decades. Hops, the preservative that gives modern beer its bitter bite, were a rare luxury in early Viking times. Instead, brewers relied on a wild mixture of herbs and spices, bog myrtle, juniper berries, wild rosemary, and sometimes substances that modern food safety experts would classify as absolutely not recommended. The result was a beverage that packed nutritional value alongside its alcoholic punch. Viking ale was essentially liquid bread, thick with proteins, carbohydrates, and vitamins that helped supplement a diet often light on variety. In the depths of winter, when fresh food was a distant memory and scurvy was a real possibility, ale provided crucial nutrients that kept the population functional, if slightly intoxicated. But ale brewing was serious business, with serious consequences. A poor batch could poison a household. An excellent batch could elevate a brewer's reputation throughout the community. Brewing ale was traditionally women's work, and brewsters wielded significant influence in Viking society. A woman who could consistently produce good ale was worth her weight in silver, quite literally. Marriage negotiations often included detailed discussions about the bride's brewing abilities, and for good reason, household social standing could rise or fall based on the quality of ale served to guests. The daily consumption of ale created a society that lived in a constant state of mild intoxication. If you think your morning coffee gives you a cognitive edge, imagine starting every day with a breakfast ale that contained enough alcohol to qualify as a light wine. Vikings went about their daily business farming, crafting, trading, raiding with a persistent background hum of alcohol in their systems. It explains a lot about their decision-making processes, actually. Quality control was a constant challenge. Without thermometers, timers, or any understanding of sanitation, ale brewing was equal parts skill and luck. Batches could turn sour overnight, develop strange flavors, or occasionally achieve transcendent perfection. Vikings developed sophisticated palates for detecting off flavors and could identify a corrupted batch with the kind of precision modern wine experts reserve for vintage Bordeaux. A mouthful of bad ale could ruin a feast and the brewer's reputation along with it. The strength of ale varied wildly depending on ingredients, brewing time, and the brewer's intentions. Everyday table ale was relatively weak, designed for constant consumption without complete cognitive impairment. Feast ale, however, was another creature, entirely a potent brew designed to fuel the kind of all-night celebrations that made Viking gatherings legendary. The transition from weak morning ale to strong evening ale was a daily ritual that gradually elevated the mood and loosened inhibitions as the day progressed. While mead ruled the ceremonial occasions and ale fueled daily life, wine occupied a peculiar position in Viking society, exotic, expensive, and absolutely irresistible to anyone with social aspirations. Wine didn't grow in Scandinavia's harsh climate, which made every drop a testament to the drinker's wealth, trading connections, and cultural sophistication. Serving wine at a Viking feast was like arriving at a dinner party in a Lamborghini, and necessary, extravagant, and guaranteed to make an impression. The wine that reached Viking tables had traveled extraordinary distances, passing through countless hands before arriving in the cold north. Most came from the Frankish kingdoms to the south, carried along trade routes that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Baltic Sea. Some arrived as tribute, payment for Viking mercenaries who had served in foreign armies. Others came through trade, exchanged for amber, furs, or the kind of military services that Vikings provided with unsettling enthusiasm. By the time wine reached a Viking mead hall, it had become exponentially more valuable than its original cost. A single amphora of decent wine might trade for a sword, a horse, or several thralls. The economics were brutal but straightforward. Anything that had to travel 1,000 miles by cart, river barge, and pack animal was going to cost a fortune. Vikings understood this markup and accepted it as the price of sophistication. The arrival of wine at a feast was a moment of high theatre. The host would often make a great show of uncorking the amphorae, allowing the exotic aroma to fill the hall before the first drops were poured. Wine was typically diluted with water, not out of preference, but out of economic necessity. Stretching the precious liquid made it last longer and served more guests. This practice also had the practical benefit of reducing the wine's potency, preventing guests from becoming completely incapacitated too quickly. Wine consumption followed strict hierarchical rules. The highest-ranking guests received the least diluted wine, while those lower on the social ladder got increasingly watery versions. A visitor's social status could be accurately gauged by the color and strength of the wine in their cup. Being served strong, undiluted wine was a mark of exceptional honor. Receiving wine that looked suspiciously like tinted water was a subtle but unmistakable insult. The Viking relationship with wine was complicated by their limited understanding of proper storage and serving. Unlike the Mediterranean cultures that produced it, Vikings lacked the knowledge and equipment for proper wine preservation. Amphorae that had traveled for months often arrived partially spoiled, oxidized, or contaminated. Vikings didn't always know the difference between wine that had developed character during its journey and wine that had simply gone bad. This led to some memorable feasts where honored guests were ceremoniously served wine that would have been better used for cleaning wounds. Despite these challenges, wine maintained its status as the ultimate luxury beverage. Viking chieftains collected wine like modern art collectors, accumulate paintings not always for immediate consumption, but as symbols of their wealth and cultural sophistication. Some leaders maintained cellars stocked with wines from different regions, though their storage methods often did more harm than good. The concept of proper temperature control was foreign to a people who lived in a climate where warm and cold were determined by whether the fjords had frozen solid. Wine also played a crucial role in diplomatic relations. Viking leaders used wine to impress foreign ambassadors, demonstrate their wealth to potential allies, and show respect to important guests. A chieftain who could serve genuine, undiluted wine was announcing to the world that he commanded trade networks, possessed substantial wealth, and maintained connections with the sophisticated southern kingdoms. It was liquid diplomacy at its most effective. The brewing process in Viking society was part chemistry, part artistry, and part religious ritual, conducted by people who understood none of the science, but all of the stakes. Without thermometers, hydrometers, or any grasp of microbiology, Viking brewers relied on generations of accumulated wisdom, careful observation, and the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from knowing that failure could result in anything from mild embarrassment to actual poisoning. The foundation of all Viking brewing was water, and finding good water was the first challenge any brewer faced. Stagnant pond water would kill you, brackish coastal water would ruin the flavor, and river water might carry any number of unpleasant surprises. Viking brewers developed an almost mystical ability to identify suitable water sources. They knew which wells produced the sweetest water, which streams ran clearest after storms, and which springs maintained consistent flow through the harshest winters. Water quality could make or break a brewing operation, and experienced brewers guarded their water sources like military secrets. Grains presented the next major challenge. Barley was the preferred base for ale, but Scandinavian growing seasons were short, harsh, and unpredictable. A bad harvest meant not just food shortages, but a drought in the beer supply, catastrophe that could destabilize entire communities. Vikings learned to work with whatever grains survived their brutal climate: oats that grew in poor soil, rye that withstood cold snaps, and occasionally wheat if the gods smiled particularly favorably on the season. The malting process required timing that would challenge a Swiss watchmaker. Grains had to be soaked until they began to sprout, then dried at exactly the right moment to stop germination while preserving the enzymes needed for fermentation. Too little sprouting, and the grains wouldn't convert properly. Too much, and they'd lose their fermentable sugars. Vikings accomplished this delicate timing through careful observation, tasting, and the accumulated wisdom of brewers who had learned through trial and error, mostly error. Heating the mash required both fuel and finesse. Vikings heated brewing liquids by dropping red-hot stones directly into wooden vats, a technique that sounds like a recipe for disaster, but actually worked remarkably well. The hot stones heated the liquid quickly and efficiently, while adding mineral content that improved the final flavor. The trick was knowing exactly how hot the stones should be, how many to use, and when to remove them before they cracked the wooden vessels or boiled away the delicate flavors. Flavorings were where Viking brewing became truly creative. And by creative, we mean they threw in whatever herbs, berries, and plant matter they could find and hoped for the best. Bog myrtle was a popular choice. It grew wild throughout Scandinavia and provided a bitter, piney flavor that helped preserve the ale. Juniper berries added a sharp, gin-like taste that masked any off flavors that might develop during fermentation. Wild herbs like meadowsweet, yarrow, and ground ivy found their way into brewing vats, each contributing its own unique character to the final product. Some Viking brewers experimented with more exotic additives. Archaeological evidence suggests they occasionally used fly agaric mushrooms, the red and white spotted toadstools, beloved by fairy tale illustrators and feared by modern toxicologists. Whether this was intentional or accidental remains unclear, but it certainly explains some of the more vivid stories found in Viking sagas. Fermentation was the most mysterious part of the process. Vikings had no understanding of yeast, bacteria, or the complex biochemical reactions that transformed grain mash into alcohol. They knew that if you left sweetened grain water alone in the right conditions, it would eventually become alcoholic, but they attributed this transformation to everything from supernatural intervention to beneficial spirits that inhabited their brewing vessels. Wooden brewing vats developed their own ecosystems of wild yeasts and bacteria over years of use. Experienced brewers never fully cleaned their vats, understanding instinctively that whatever invisible forces lived in the wood were responsible for successful fermentation. These vessels became family heirlooms, passed down through generations like precious treasures. A brewing vat that consistently produced good ale was worth more than gold. It represented decades of successful fermentations and the accumulated wisdom of countless brewing cycles. Temperature control during fermentation was achieved through pure intuition and careful observation. Too cold, and fermentation would stall; too warm, and it would proceed too quickly, producing harsh, unpleasant flavors. Vikings learned to read the subtle signs of healthy fermentation, the gentle bubbling that indicated active yeast, the sweet-sour aroma of grain converting to alcohol. The gradual clearing that signaled the process was nearing completion. The geography and climate of Scandinavia shaped Viking drinking culture in ways both obvious and subtle, creating a civilization where alcohol wasn't just entertainment, but essential survival equipment. If you think seasonal affective disorder is challenging in a modern apartment with central heating and electric lights, imagine facing an entire winter in a world where the sun disappears for months and your primary source of vitamin D comes from whatever you managed to ferment before the harvest ended. Scandinavia's location at the edge of the habitable world created unique challenges that alcohol helped solve. The long, dark winters that stretched from October to April weren't just inconvenient, they were psychologically crushing. Modern science understands the relationship between sunlight, vitamin synthesis, and mental health. Vikings didn't understand the science, but they instinctively grasped that alcohol helped people endure the endless darkness with something approaching sanity intact. The harsh climate also made water quality a constant concern. Rivers that ran clean in summer could become contaminated breeding grounds for disease during the warmer months. Wells that provided sweet water in autumn might freeze solid for half the year. Vikings learned that fermented beverages were not only safer to drink than questionable water, but actually provided essential nutrients that fresh water couldn't supply. Brewing aligned perfectly with Scandinavian agricultural cycles. The brief growing season meant that grain had to be harvested, processed, and preserved quickly before winter arrived. Converting surplus grain into ale served multiple purposes. It preserved the nutritional value of the harvest, created a stable food source that wouldn't spoil, and provided a way to store calories in liquid form. A family's brewing success often determined whether they would survive the winter comfortably fed or scrape by on the edge of starvation. The ingredients available in Scandinavia shaped the distinctive character of Viking alcoholic beverages. Wild honey from forest bees created mead with floral complexity that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Juniper berries that grew in abundance across the northern forests provided a unique flavoring that became synonymous with Nordic brewing. Bog myrtle, meadowsweet, and other indigenous herbs created flavor profiles that were distinctly Scandinavian. Trading relationships expanded the range of available ingredients and created a complex economy around beverage production. Viking traders carried Scandinavian amber and furs south, returning with wine, exotic spices, and brewing knowledge from more temperate climates. These trading expeditions weren't just commercial ventures, they were educational exchanges that brought new brewing techniques and ingredients back to northern communities. The seasonal rhythm of Viking society revolved around the brewing calendar. Spring brought fresh water as ice melted, and streams ran clear. Summer meant gathering wild herbs and honey for flavoring. Autumn was the crucial harvest season, when grain was converted into the ale and mead that would sustain communities through winter. Winter was the time for consumption, when carefully hoarded alcoholic beverages provided both nutrition and the psychological fortification needed to endure months of cold and darkness. Climate change, even the minor fluctuations of the medieval period, had dramatic effects on Viking brewing. A series of good summers might produce surplus grain that could be converted into high-quality ale. Poor harvests forced communities to stretch their grain supplies, resulting in weaker ale, or forcing them to rely more heavily on whatever honey could be gathered from wild bees. The Little Ice Age, that began in the later medieval period, gradually made grape cultivation impossible in regions where Vikings had established vineyards, forcing them to rely more heavily on imported wine or abandon wine consumption altogether. The social implications of geography shaped drinking customs in profound ways. Communities that lived near major trading routes had access to exotic ingredients and foreign brewing techniques. Isolated settlements developed distinctive local traditions based on whatever ingredients their particular environment provided. Coastal communities with access to fish could afford to trade preserved seafood for grain, allowing them to convert more of their harvest into alcohol. Inland communities dependent on agriculture had to balance carefully between grain for food and grain for brewing. Ultimately, Viking drinking culture was inseparable from the harsh realities of life in medieval Scandinavia. What appears from a modern perspective as excessive consumption was actually a sophisticated survival strategy developed over generations. Vikings didn't drink because they were careless warriors who couldn't hold their alcohol. They drank because alcohol helped them survive in one of the most challenging environments humans had yet learned to inhabit permanently. In a world where winter could kill you, water might poison you, and vitamin deficiencies were a constant threat, alcohol wasn't a luxury, it was liquid life insurance, served one horn at a time. If you think your living room is the center of your social universe, the Vikings would like to introduce you to the Mead Haller building so central to their civilization that it functioned simultaneously as parliament, church, hotel, entertainment complex, and occasionally, battlefield. These weren't just large buildings where people happened to drink. They were the beating heart of Viking society, architectural manifestos that declared to the world exactly who held power, who deserved respect, and who would be sleeping face down in the straw by midnight. The Mead Hall was where Vikings conducted the serious business of being Viking, forging alliances, settling disputes, planning raids, celebrating victories, and engaging in the kind of competitive drinking that would make modern fraternity brothers weep with admiration. But beneath the revelry and the flowing alcohol lay a sophisticated social machine, a carefully orchestrated theatre where every seat, every gesture, every toast carried meaning that could determine the fate of kingdoms. Miss the subtle signals, sit in the wrong place, or toast the wrong person, and you might find yourself explaining your diplomatic blunder to the business end of a very sharp axe. These halls weren't just buildings, they were statements of power, monuments to ambition, and occasionally, fire hazards of truly spectacular proportions. To understand Viking society, you had to understand the Mead Hall, because everything that mattered in the Norse world happened within its smoke-blackened walls. Building a proper Mead Hall was like constructing a medieval skyscraper, except instead of steel and concrete, you had wood, determination, and a labor force that would rather be raiding monasteries. The scale of these projects was staggering, requiring resources that could bankrupt kingdoms and engineering skills that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with Bronze Age technology and Viking stubbornness. The greatest mead halls were monuments to excess that would have impressed Roman emperors. Heorot, the legendary hall of the Danish king Hrothgar, described in Beowulf, was said to be so magnificent that its fame spread across entire continents. Archaeological evidence suggests these descriptions weren't entirely poetic, exaggeration some. Halls stretched over 150 feet in length and reached heights that required engineering techniques typically associated with cathedral construction. The foundation of any self-respecting mead hall began with the selection of timber, and Vikings approached this task with the seriousness of modern architects choosing steel grades. Oak was the gold standard, strong, durable, and possessed of the kind of symbolic weight that impressed visitors and intimidated enemies. But acquiring enough oak to build a great hall meant felling trees that had been growing since before Christ was born. These weren't weekend construction projects. They were generational undertakings that consumed the wealth and labor of entire communities. Tree selection was an art form that combined practical engineering with mystical belief. Vikings didn't just cut down any forest. They sought trees that had grown in specific conditions, orientations, and locations. Some builders insisted on timber from trees that had been struck by lightning, believing that Odin's touch made the wood supernaturally strong. Others demanded trees that had grown on certain types of soil or faced particular directions. The result was a timber hunting expedition that could take months and require the cooperation of multiple settlements. The actual construction process resembled a medieval barn raising crossed with a military campaign. Hundreds of workers, from skilled carpenters to enthusiastic amateurs, gathered to raise the massive timber frame that would support the hall's soaring roof. The central posts, often single tree trunks 40 feet tall, had to be positioned with millimeter precision. A mistake here could result in the entire structure collapsing during the first winter storm, taking half the local nobility with it. Viking carpenters developed joinery techniques that would impress modern woodworkers, without nails, screws, or metal fasteners of any kind. They created interlocking joints that held massive timbers together through nothing but precise cutting and the understanding that failure meant death by falling beam. Mortise and tenon joints, dovetails, and complex interlocking systems transferred the enormous loads of the roof down through the frame to the foundation. It was engineering by intuition, guided by generations of accumulated wisdom and the certain knowledge that shoddy workmanship would be literally crushing. The roof presented its own set of challenges that would challenge modern construction crews. These weren't modest little peaked roofs. They were soaring structures that reached toward the sky, like inverted ship hulls. The roof timbers had to span incredible distances without intermediate support, creating vast open spaces beneath. Vikings accomplished this through a combination of careful engineering and what can only be described as architectural prayer. Massive ridge beams, supported by carefully calculated trusses, carried the weight of thousands of pounds of thatch, creating interior spaces that could accommodate hundreds of people without a single supporting column blocking the view. The walls were constructed with the kind of precision that suggests Vikings understood load-bearing principles, even if they couldn't calculate them mathematically. Vertical posts were mortised into horizontal beams, creating a framework strong enough to support the enormous roof while providing the structural integrity needed to withstand Scandinavian storms. The gaps between the timbers were filled with wattle and daub-woven branches plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung that hardened into a surprisingly effective insulating barrier. Windows were a luxury that most halls couldn't afford, both economically and structurally. Glass was essentially non-existent, and cutting large openings in load-bearing walls was a recipe for structural failure. Instead, halls relied on carefully positioned openings that could be covered with oiled animal hides or wooden shutters. The result was an interior that remained perpetually dim, lit primarily by the central fire and whatever oil lamps or torches the inhabitants could afford to burn. The floors required their own engineering solutions. Simply laying planks over dirt would result in rot, pest infestations, and the kind of structural failure that could ruin a perfectly good feast. Viking builders created raised floors using techniques that demonstrated their understanding of moisture control and structural stability. Wooden floors were elevated on posts or stone foundations, allowing air circulation that prevented rot while providing insulation from the cold ground beneath. Interior finishing was where mead halls transformed from mere buildings into statements of power and wealth. The finest halls featured carved wooden panels that told stories of heroic deeds, mythological scenes, or abstract patterns that spoke to the artistic sophistication of their creators. These weren't crude carvings hacked out by bored farmers. They were sophisticated artworks created by skilled craftsmen who understood both the technical requirements of structural decoration and the cultural significance of the imagery they created. The central hearth was both the functional and spiritual center of the hall, requiring engineering that balanced heating efficiency with smoke management and fire safety. Vikings developed sophisticated chimney systems that drew smoke away from the living areas while retaining as much heat as possible. The hearth itself was often raised on a platform of stones, both for safety and to create a focal point that dominated the interior space. The size and quality of the hearth announced the wealth and status of the hall's owner. A massive, elaborate hearth meant a powerful lord. A modest fire pit suggested someone still working their way up the Viking social ladder. Entering a great mead hall was like walking into a three-dimensional social hierarchy chart, where your worth as a human being could be calculated by measuring the distance between your seat and the lord's high table. Vikings didn't believe in egalitarian seating arrangements. They believed in putting everyone exactly where they belonged according to their rank, wealth, fighting ability, and political connections. Miss the signals, sit in the wrong place, and you'd spend the evening being reminded of your social position through a series of increasingly unsubtle hints. The high table dominated every mead hall like a wooden altar to ambition and authority. Positioned on a raised platform at the far end of the hall from the main entrance, it commanded a clear view of the entire gathering while placing the lord and his most important guests literally above everyone else. This wasn't accidental. It was architectural psychology designed to reinforce power relationships with every glance. When the Jarl stood to make a toast, every person in the hall had to look up to see him, a subtle but constant reminder of who held ultimate authority. The lord's seat itself was a throne in all but name, often elaborately carved and cushioned with the finest furs available. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these chairs were works of art that required months to create, featuring intricate carvings that depicted the owner's heroic deeds, mythological scenes, or complex patterns that demonstrated the artistic sophistication of the court. Sitting in the lord's chair uninvited wasn't just rude, it was a political statement that could result in immediate and violent consequences. Immediately to the right and left of the lord sat his most trusted companions, warriors who had proven their loyalty in battle, advisors whose counsel had proved valuable, and family members whose bloodlines guaranteed their positions. These seats were coveted positions that reflected both current status and future prospects. A warrior who found himself seated closer to the lord knew he was rising in favor. One who discovered he'd been moved farther away understood that his stock was falling, and he needed to perform some heroic deed to regain his position. The arrangement of the high table itself told a story that everyone in the hall could read like a medieval spreadsheet. The most honored guest sat to the lord's right, a position that granted both prestige and practical advantages. From this seat, a guest could speak privately with their host, influence decisions, and demonstrate to everyone present that they enjoyed the lord's special favor. Being seated to the lord's left was still an honor, but a clearly secondary one that everyone understood represented a step down in the hierarchy. Below the high table, the hall was arranged in a carefully calculated grid of status and influence. Warriors sat according to their reputation and recent accomplishments. A young fighter who had distinguished himself in a recent raid might find himself seated closer to the front than veterans whose glory days had faded. Craftsmen, merchants, and other non-warrior members of the community occupied their own sections, their placement determined by their economic importance to the community and their personal relationships with the Lord. The seating arrangement was fluid, changing with circumstances, alliances, and the political winds that constantly shifted through Viking society. A merchant who had just returned from a profitable trading expedition might find himself seated closer to the high table than usual. A warrior who had been defeated in a recent conflict might discover his usual seat had been reassigned to someone whose star was rising. These changes were noted by everyone present and discussed long after the feast ended. Women's seating followed its own complex protocol that reflected both their social status and their relationships to the men in the hall. The lady of the hall occupied a position of honor at the high table, often holding significant influence over the evening's proceedings. Other women were seated according to their marriages, family connections, or their own accomplishments in areas like brewing, weaving, or managing household affairs. A woman known for brewing exceptional ale might find herself seated in a position that reflected her economic importance to the community. The physical distance between seats translated directly into social distance. Conversations, toasts, and the sharing of choice food portions all followed the seating hierarchy. A warrior seated in the back benches couldn't easily participate in the discussions happening at the high table, effectively excluding him from the decision-making process. This wasn't accidental. It was a carefully designed system that ensured important conversations remained among the important people. Servants and thralls occupied the margins of the hall, standing along the walls or sitting on low stools that emphasized their subordinate status. They were present, but not participating, visible reminders of the social order that defined Viking society. Even among the servants, there was hierarchy. Those who served the high table held higher status than those who cleared tables or managed the fire. The serving of food and drink followed the seating hierarchy with religious precision. The Lord and his high table were served first, receiving the choicest portions of meat, the strongest mead, and the most attention from the hall's staff. Service then proceeded down the social ladder, with each level receiving portions and beverages that reflected their station. By the time service reached the back benches, the meat was tougher, the ale was weaker, and the bread was day-old, but everyone understood this was the natural order of things. Changing seats during a feast was a delicate diplomatic maneuver that required careful consideration of the political implications. A lord might invite a particular guest to join him at the high table as a mark of special favor, but such invitations carried obligations and expectations. Accepting meant entering into the complex web of alliance and obligation that defined the relationship between lord and follower. Declining could be interpreted as an insult that damaged relationships and future prospects. The seating arrangement also determined who could speak when and to whom. Conversations flowed according to social precedents, with lower-ranking individuals expected to listen respectfully when their superiors spoke. Interrupting someone of higher rank was not just rude, it was a violation of the social order that could result in serious consequences. Young warriors learned to speak only when spoken to and to measure their words carefully when addressing their betters. For visitors and guests, navigating the seating hierarchy required diplomatic skills that would challenge modern ambassadors. Foreign dignitaries had to be seated in positions that reflected both their own status and their relationship with their host, while avoiding inadvertent insults that could damage inter-community relationships. A visiting jarl expected to be seated according to his rank. A merchant hoped for placement that reflected his economic importance. A warrior looked for recognition of his martial accomplishments. The seating hierarchy extended beyond the evening's entertainment to influence long-term relationships and political alliances. Warriors who consistently found themselves seated near the high table understood they were being groomed for greater responsibilities. Those who noticed their seats gradually moving toward the back knew they needed to prove their worth through heroic deeds or risk being marginalized entirely. The mead hall seating chart was a constantly updated assessment of each individual's value to the community and their prospects for future advancement. If you think modern hospitality is complex, with its careful attention to dietary restrictions and seating arrangements, Vikings had elevated guest treatment to an art form that combined genuine warmth with life-or-death political calculations. The concept of hospitality in Viking culture wasn't just about being nice to visitors. It was a sacred obligation, protected by gods and custom, a social contract that could determine whether communities lived in peace or burned each other's settlements to the ground. The moment a traveller approached a mead hall, they entered a carefully choreographed ritual that had been refined over generations. The very act of crossing the threshold created obligations and expectations on both sides that were taken as seriously as modern international treaties. Hosts who failed to provide proper hospitality faced not just social embarrassment, but divine punishment, while guests who violated the rules of proper behavior could find themselves exiled, outlawed, or decorating the business end of a spear. The initial greeting set the tone for everything that followed. A lord who personally welcomed a guest at the threshold demonstrated respect and established a relationship of equals. A guest who was met by servants understood they were being treated with courtesy but not necessarily honor. The exchange of formal greetings, the offering of refreshments, and the ritual washing of hands and faces all carried, meaning that experienced Vikings could read like a diplomatic code. The quality and quantity of food and drink offered to guests served as a precise barometer of their host's respect and their own perceived importance. A guest offered the finest mead from the lord's personal reserves, understood they were being honored. One served weak ale, got the message that they were welcome, but not particularly valued. The type of meat served, whether fresh venison, aged beef, or day-old mutton, communicated volumes about the guest's status and the host's assessment of their political or economic value. Sacred laws protected guests once they had been formally welcomed and had shared food and drink with their hosts. This protection extended beyond simple courtesy to create a relationship that was considered divinely sanctioned. Harming a guest who had eaten at your table wasn't just murder, it was a violation of cosmic order that would bring down the wrath of the gods. This protection was taken so seriously that enemies who had shared hospitality were expected to refrain from violence until the guest relationship had been formally ended. The duration of hospitality followed, established customs that balanced generosity with practical limitations. A guest could typically expect 3 days of full hospitality food, drink, shelter, and entertainment, without any questions about their purpose or destination. This 3-day rule created a buffer zone that allowed travelers to rest, conduct business, and prepare for the next leg of their journey, while giving hosts time to assess their visitors' intentions and potential value. The guest quarters themselves reflected the social status of both host and visitor. Important guests might be offered private chambers with their own fires, fresh rushes on the floor, and comfortable sleeping arrangements. Lesser visitors shared communal sleeping areas, but still received protection from the elements and adequate food and drink. The quality of accommodations served as another form of social communication, conveying respect, indifference, or subtle insult through the comfort provided. Gift-giving was an essential component of hospitality that created lasting bonds between hosts and guests. Lords were expected to present worthy visitors with gifts that reflected both their wealth and their respect for their guests. Weapons, jewelry, fine clothing, or valuable trade goods all served as appropriate gifts, but the choice of gift conveyed specific meanings. A weapon suggested the host saw the guest as a warrior worthy of respect. Jewelry indicated personal favor. Trade goods implied a desire for ongoing commercial relationships. Guests, in turn, were expected to reciprocate with gifts appropriate to their own status and resources. A wealthy merchant might offer exotic goods from distant lands, A warrior might present a weapon or piece of armor. A craftsman could provide examples of their finest work. The exchange of gifts created networks of obligation and alliance that could last for generations, turning casual encounters into lasting political relationships. The entertainment provided to guests served multiple purposes beyond simple courtesy. Skaldic poetry, musical performances, and storytelling demonstrated the cultural sophistication of the host, while providing opportunities for guests to share news, tales, and information from their travels. These evening performances were often the most valuable part of the hospitality experience, creating opportunities for diplomatic communication, intelligence gathering, and cultural exchange. The rules governing the end of hospitality were as complex as those governing its beginning. Guests who overstayed their welcome without contributing to the household through work, entertainment, or valuable information risked transitioning from honored visitors to unwelcome burdens. Hosts had diplomatic ways of suggesting that guests might want to continue their journeys, but persistent freeloaders could find themselves unceremoniously ejected with considerably less ceremony than they had been welcomed. Violations of hospitality customs carried severe consequences that could extend far beyond the immediate participants. A host who mistreated guests could find their reputation damaged throughout the region, making future diplomatic and commercial relationships difficult or impossible. Word of poor hospitality spread quickly through the interconnected networks of traders, travelers, and warriors, creating reputational damage that could last for generations. The sacred nature of hospitality meant that even enemies were protected, while guests, creating some remarkably awkward situations when competing jarls found themselves sharing the same hall. Protocol demanded that personal conflicts be set aside during the period of hospitality, leading to tense but civil interactions where sworn enemies passed food, shared stories, and maintained polite conversation while plotting each other's destruction once the guest relationship ended. Hospitality customs varied somewhat between regions and social levels, but the core principles remained consistent throughout the Viking world. A poor farmer was expected to share what little he had with travelers, while wealthy lords were obligated to provide lavish entertainment befitting their status. The scale of hospitality might differ, but the underlying obligations and protections remained the same. The reputation for hospitality became a form of political capital that wise leaders cultivated carefully. A lord known for generous hospitality attracted visitors, traders, and potential allies, creating networks of information and influence that provided significant advantages. Conversely, a reputation for poor hospitality could isolate a leader, cutting them off from the information, trade, and alliances essential for political survival in the competitive world of Viking politics. In a society where written contracts were rare and legal institutions were primitive, the ritual drinking that accompanied hospitality served as a form of social glue that held Viking civilization together. When two jarls raised horns of mead in each other's honor, they weren't just being polite. They were participating in a ceremony that created bonds stronger than any written treaty, more binding than any oath sworn before witnesses. The act of drinking together transformed strangers into allies, enemies into friends, and individual warriors into brotherhood, bound by shared alcohol and mutual obligation. Vikings understood intuitively what modern sociology has confirmed through research. Shared consumption creates social bonds that transcend rational calculation. When you've shared a horn of mead with someone, when you've toasted their health and they've toasted yours, when you've laughed at the same jokes and sung the same songs, it becomes remarkably difficult to subsequently stick a sword between their ribs. Alliance-making through alcohol followed well-established rituals that combined religious ceremony with political theatre. The most formal alliances began with the presentation of a special drinking horn, often a family heirloom or a vessel crafted specifically for the occasion. These horns weren't just containers, they were sacred objects that carried the weight of ancestral approval and divine blessing. Drinking from such a horn meant accepting not just the alliance, but the spiritual obligations that came with it. The toasting ceremony itself was a carefully choreographed performance that made the terms of alliance clear to everyone present. Each participant would rise, raise their drinking horn, and speak formal words that outlined their commitments and expectations. These weren't casual promises made over a friendly drink. They were binding agreements witnessed by hundreds of people and sanctified by the gods. Breaking such an alliance wasn't just betrayal, it was perjury committed in the presence of the divine. The alcohol consumed during alliance-making ceremonies wasn't chosen randomly. Mead, with its association with divine wisdom and poetic inspiration, was preferred for the most solemn agreements. The honey wine was believed to carry the blessings of the gods and to inspire the kind of wisdom needed for lasting alliances. Ale might suffice for less formal agreements, but wine, when available, added an element of exotic sophistication that enhanced the ceremony's importance. Trading partnerships were often sealed with drinking rituals that combined business arrangements with social bonding. Merchants who had concluded successful negotiations would share drinks that formalized their agreements while celebrating their mutual profit. These drinking sessions served multiple purposes. They created personal relationships that transcended mere commercial transactions. They provided opportunities to share information about markets and opportunities, and they established the trust necessary for long-distance trade relationships. Marriage alliances, perhaps the most important political arrangements in Viking society, required the most elaborate drinking ceremonies. Wedding feasts could last for days, with continuous rounds of toasts that celebrated not just the union of two individuals, but the alliance of their families, clans, and communities. The bride and groom would share a special cup that symbolized their union, while their families exchanged toasts that outlined mutual obligations and expectations. Military alliances required their own distinctive drinking rituals that combined oath-taking with demonstrations of martial prowess. Warriors would pledge their loyalty while sharing weapons-grade alcohol that tested their ability to maintain composure under the influence. These ceremonies often devolved into competitive drinking that served the practical purpose of testing whether potential allies could hold their alcohol well enough to be trusted in battle. The psychological effects of alcohol played a crucial role in alliance making by reducing inhibitions and creating artificial intimacy between negotiating parties. Vikings understood that people who had shared drinks together were more likely to trust each other, more willing to overlook minor slights, and more inclined to interpret ambiguous actions favorably. Strategic hosts would ensure that their guests were well supplied with alcohol before beginning serious negotiations. The timing of drinking during alliance making was carefully calibrated to achieve maximum psychological effect. Initial toasts were typically made with weaker beverages that allowed clear thinking during the formal negotiations. As the evening progressed and agreements were reached, stronger drinks were introduced to cement emotional bonds and create the kind of euphoric celebration that made participants feel genuinely positive about their new relationships. Drinking alliances created networks of obligation that could span generations and extend across vast distances. A warrior who had shared mead with a distant jarl carried an obligation to provide assistance if called upon, even years later. These alcohol-sealed bonds created the complex web of relationships that allowed Viking society to function despite the absence of centralized government or formal legal institutions. The violation of drinking alliances carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants. A leader who betrayed agreements made over shared alcohol would find his reputation damaged throughout the Viking world. Word of such betrayals spread through the interconnected networks of traders, warriors, and skalds, making future alliance-making difficult or impossible. The economics of alliance-making through alcohol were substantial, requiring significant investment in quality beverages, elaborate ceremonies, and extended hospitality. Lords who aspired to political importance had to maintain stockpiles of mead, ale, and wine sufficient to seal major agreements. The cost of these ceremonies represented a significant portion of a leader's wealth, but the political benefits justified the expense. Successful alliance-making required careful attention to the preferences and customs of potential partners. A leader negotiating with southern merchants might emphasize wine to demonstrate sophisticated taste. One seeking alliances with traditional warriors might stress mead to appeal to conservative values. Understanding the drinking customs and preferences of negotiating partners was essential diplomatic intelligence. The physical act of sharing drinking vessels created symbolic unity that transcended individual interests. When two leaders drank from the same horn, they were literally sharing the same liquid, the same risk, and the same spiritual blessing. This physical intimacy created psychological bonds that purely verbal agreements could never match. Competitive drinking often accompanied alliance-making as potential partners tested each other's capacity for alcohol, their ability to maintain dignity under pressure, and their worthiness as companions in both celebration and warfare. These contests weren't just entertainment, they were practical assessments of character that helped determine whether someone could be trusted as an ally. The morning after alliance-making ceremonies often proved as important as the celebrations themselves. Leaders who maintained their dignity, remembered their commitments, and showed no signs of regret about agreements made while drinking demonstrated the kind of reliability that made for lasting partnerships. Those who appeared to have second thoughts or claimed not to remember their promises found future alliance-making considerably more difficult. In the smoky, firelit atmosphere of the mead hall, where alcohol flowed like rivers and inhibitions evaporated like morning mist, the skalds held court as the ultimate masters of entertainment, education, and occasionally, character assassination. These weren't just wandering minstrels with harps and pretty voices. They were the living memory of Viking civilization, the human databases who stored the histories, genealogies, and heroic deeds that defined Norse culture. A skilled skald could make or break reputations, start wars with a well-placed verse, or ensure immortality for those wise enough to keep them well-fed and properly lubricated with quality mead. The relationship between alcohol and skaldic performance was so intertwined that attempting to separate them would be like trying to understand modern karaoke without considering the role of beer. Skalds didn't just perform for drunk audiences, they performed drunk in a culture that believed alcohol enhanced poetic inspiration and brought the performer closer to the divine source of wisdom. The best skaldic poetry was thought to emerge from the same mystical state that connected drinkers to the gods, making intoxicated performance not just acceptable, but spiritually necessary. A skald's arrival at a mead hall was an event that could transform an ordinary feast into a legendary celebration. These performers traveled from hall to hall, carrying with them vast repertoires of poems, stories, and songs that could entertain audiences for days. They were walking encyclopedias of Norse culture, capable of reciting genealogies going back 20 generations, remembering the details of battles fought decades earlier, and improvising new compositions that captured the essence of current events in memorable verse. The economic relationship between skalds and their audiences was straightforward: entertainment for alcohol, with the quality of both being directly proportional. A skald who could hold an audience spellbound for hours deserved the finest mead from the Lord's personal reserves. One whose performance fell flat might find himself drinking weak ale and sleeping in the stables. The best skalds commanded fees that included not just hospitality, but valuable gifts, weapons, jewelry, fine clothing, and occasionally land grants that could support them for life. Skaldic poetry was far more complex than simple storytelling or crude entertainment. The traditional forms required intricate rhyme schemes, complex metaphors, and alliterative patterns that demanded both linguistic skill and encyclopedic knowledge of Norse mythology. A single stanza might contain half a dozen mythological references, geographical allusions, and historical parallels that educated audiences were expected to recognize and appreciate. Performing such poetry while maintaining the meter and meaning required mental agility that would challenge sober scholars, let alone intoxicated entertainers. The competitive aspect of skaldic performance added an element of intellectual bloodsport to mead hall entertainment. Skalds would engage in poetry contests that tested not just their artistic skills, but their knowledge, wit, and ability to maintain composure under pressure. These contests often involved improvised compositions on assigned themes, requiring participants to create complex poetry on the spot while dealing with increasingly challenging topics and escalating levels of intoxication. The political power of skalds stemmed from their role as the primary means of preserving and transmitting reputation in a largely illiterate society. A warrior's deeds meant nothing if no skald remembered them. A lord's generosity was worthless unless it was celebrated in verse that would be repeated in halls throughout the Viking world. This gave skalds tremendous influence over the reputations that determined political success, making them valuable allies and dangerous enemies for ambitious leaders. The content of skaldic performances was carefully calibrated to the audience and the political situation. A skald, performing for a powerful jarl, would emphasize that leaders' heroic deeds, generous hospitality, and wise leadership. The same skald, performing in a rival's hall, might subtly shift emphasis to highlight different virtues, or even include veiled criticisms disguised as praise. The art lay in crafting verses that pleased the immediate audience, while maintaining plausible deniability if the words were later reported to their subjects. Religious elements permeated skaldic performance, connecting entertainment to the spiritual beliefs that undergirded Viking society. Many poems recounted mythological tales that reinforced cultural values and religious understanding. The performance of these pieces became a form of worship, with the skald serving as a priest who channeled divine wisdom through verse. The alcohol consumed during these performances was believed to enhance the spiritual connection, allowing both performer and audience to commune with the gods through shared intoxication. The memorization techniques employed by skalds were marvels of cognitive engineering that would impress modern memory champions. Without written text to reference, skalds had to maintain vast mental libraries of poetry, songs, and stories. They developed sophisticated mnemonic systems that used rhythm, alliteration, and narrative structure to encode information in ways that made it resistant to the cognitive impairment caused by alcohol consumption. A truly skilled skald could perform flawlessly, even when drunk enough to challenge a charging berserker. The social status of skalds was complex and somewhat contradictory. They were honored guests who could command the attention of kings and jarls, yet they remained dependent on the generosity of their patrons. They possessed tremendous influence over public opinion and historical memory, yet they were essentially sophisticated beggars who traded entertainment for food and shelter. This tension created a unique social position that granted them both respect and resentment from their audiences. Training new skalds was a process that combined literary education with alcohol tolerance building. Young apprentices had to master not just the technical requirements of complex poetry, but also the social skills needed to read audiences, the political awareness necessary to avoid dangerous topics, and the physical stamina required to perform for hours while maintaining increasing levels of intoxication. The dropout rate was substantial, with many aspiring skalds discovering that the combination of intellectual and physical demands exceeded their capabilities. The accuracy of skaldic historical accounts was complicated by the medium's requirements for entertainment value and the alcohol-soaked circumstances of most performances. Skalds were expected to make their stories exciting, which often meant embellishing facts, inventing dialogue, and adding dramatic details that improved narrative flow. The line between history and entertainment was deliberately blurred, creating a cultural record that was emotionally true, even when factually questionable. The relationship between skalds and their audiences was interactive in ways that modern performance rarely achieves. Audience members would interrupt performances to request specific stories, challenge details, or add their own recollections. This created a collaborative form of entertainment, where the final product emerged from the interaction between performer and audience, mediated by increasing levels of alcohol that made everyone more creative and less critical. International politics influenced skaldic performance as skalds carried news, gossip, and propaganda between communities. A skald who had recently performed in a rival's hall might be questioned extensively about the strength of their forces, the quality of their leadership, and the loyalty of their followers. This intelligence-gathering function made skalds valuable sources of information and occasionally targets for elimination by leaders who preferred their secrets to remain secret. The decline of skaldic culture paralleled the decline of the mead hall tradition that had supported it. As Viking society became more centralized and literate, the demand for oral performance decreased. Written records began to replace human memory as the primary means of preserving information, reducing the skald's monopoly on cultural transmission. The rise of Christianity also challenged the religious aspects of skaldic performance, as pagan mythology was gradually replaced by Christian themes that required different artistic approaches. Yet in their heyday, when mead flowed freely and the northern nights stretched endlessly, skalds transformed simple drinking sessions into transcendent experiences that connected mortal audiences to the eternal themes of heroism, honor, and human aspiration. They proved that the combination of alcohol, artistry, and audience could create something greater than the sum of its parts, a cultural alchemy that turned simple entertainment into the foundation of civilization itself. For all their sophistication in managing alcohol consumption, hosting elaborate feasts, and maintaining complex social hierarchies, Vikings were still fundamentally human beings, making increasingly poor decisions as the evening progressed and the mead kept flowing. The same drinking culture that created alliances, preserved history, and cemented social bonds also produced spectacular failures of judgment that could end kingdoms, destroy families, and turn friends into lifelong enemies before the hangover even set in. The morning after a major feast often revealed the true cost of Viking drinking culture, and it wasn't just measured in empty barrels and aching heads. When alcohol loosened tongues, lowered inhibitions, and impaired judgment among people who routinely carried sharp weapons and harbored generations-old grudges, the potential for disaster was unlimited. What began as celebration could end in bloodshed, exile, or the kind of diplomatic incident that required years to resolve, assuming anyone involved survived long enough to attempt reconciliation. And yet, despite the obvious risks and occasional catastrophic consequences, Vikings continued to structure their entire civilization around communal drinking because the benefits: social cohesion, political alliance, cultural transmission, and sheer survival in a harsh world outweighed the dangers. The mead hall stood as testimony to humanity's eternal optimism, the belief that this time, surely, everyone would know when to stop drinking before things got completely out of hand. They were, naturally, frequently wrong about this. If you think your office holiday party gets awkward when someone has one too many eggnogs, you've clearly never witnessed a Viking religious ceremony where communion with the gods required consuming enough alcohol to fell a small horse. These weren't casual social drinkers who happened to believe in Norse mythology. They were people who had systematically transformed the simple act of getting drunk into a complex theological exercise that connected the mortal world to the divine realm through the sacred medium of fermented beverages. Every sip was a prayer, every toast a ritual invocation, and every drinking horn a chalice that bridged the gap between Midgard and Asgard. Vikings didn't just drink to honor their gods. They believed the gods themselves were actively participating in the consumption, sharing in the alcohol, and blessing those who approached intoxication with the proper reverence and ceremonial precision. Miss a toast, drink out of turn, or fail to observe the proper protocols, and you weren't just being rude, you were committing blasphemy that could bring divine wrath down upon your entire community. This was a civilization that had elevated drinking to the level of high art, complex theology, and occasionally mortal combat. They understood something that modern society has largely forgotten, that shared intoxication, when properly channeled through ritual and ceremony, could create bonds stronger than blood, deeper than friendship, and more lasting than any written contract. The drinking horn wasn't just a vessel, it was a sacred instrument that transformed ordinary alcohol into liquid destiny. The ceremonial passing of drinking horns was perhaps the most sacred and politically charged ritual in all of Viking society, a choreographed dance of honor, hierarchy, and spiritual communion that could determine the fate of kingdoms, depending on who drank, when, and from which horn. These weren't casual beverage containers that happened to be made from animal horns. They were family heirlooms, artistic masterpieces, and religious artifacts that carried the accumulated spiritual weight of generations of ceremonial use. The finest drinking horns were works of art that required months to create and represented enormous investments of both material wealth and artistic skill. Master craftsmen selected horns from the largest, most impressive aurochs, the massive wild cattle, whose horns could stretch 3 feet from tip to base. These horns were then carefully cleaned, polished, and decorated with intricate metalwork that might include silver inlay, gold filigree, and precious stones that caught the firelight and announced the owner's wealth to everyone in the hall. The most prestigious horns carried names, histories, and legends that were recounted whenever they appeared at important ceremonies. Some were said to have belonged to legendary heroes, others were gifts from powerful allies, and a few were believed to possess supernatural properties that enhanced the luck of anyone who drank from them. A horn with a distinguished pedigree could be worth more than a ship, a herd of cattle, or several thralls, making them among the most valuable possessions in Viking society. The selection of which horn to use for a particular ceremony was a decision that carried profound political and spiritual implications. Different horns were appropriate for different occasions, some were reserved for religious ceremonies, others for political negotiations, and still others for celebrations of military victory. Using the wrong horn could be interpreted as an insult, a sign of disrespect, or evidence of poor judgment that damaged the host's reputation throughout the community. The physical act of passing the horn followed protocols so complex they would challenge modern diplomats. The horn always moved in a clockwise direction, following the path of the sun across the sky and honoring the cosmic order that governed both mortal and divine realms. To pass a horn counterclockwise was considered deeply inauspicious, potentially inviting disaster upon the entire gathering. The direction of passage wasn't arbitrary tradition, it was cosmic law that aligned earthly ceremonies with celestial movements. Each person who received the horn faced a moment of profound responsibility that extended far beyond simple etiquette. They had to hold the horn correctly, 2 hands, raised to chest level, in a gesture that demonstrated both respect for the vessel and awareness of its sacred nature. The horn could not be set down until it was either emptied or passed to the next participant. Placing it on a table or bench was considered an insult to both the vessel and its contents. The speed of drinking was crucial and required careful calibration between respect for the ceremony and practical considerations of alcohol consumption. Drinking too quickly suggested greed or disrespect for the solemnity of the ritual. Drinking too slowly held up the ceremony and demonstrated either weakness or lack of commitment to the proceedings. Experienced participants developed an intuitive sense of the proper pace that honored the ceremony, while avoiding complete intoxication before the ritual concluded. The words spoken while holding the horn carried enormous weight and were considered as binding as any oath sworn on sacred objects. These weren't casual remarks or friendly conversation. They were formal declarations that called upon the gods as witnesses and established obligations that could last for generations. A careless word spoken while holding a ceremonial horn could create debts of honor, trigger blood feuds, or establish alliances that bound entire families to courses of action they never intended. The responsibility of maintaining the horns fell to specialized craftsmen who understood both the technical requirements of preservation and the spiritual significance of their care. Horn keepers were respected positions that required knowledge of proper cleaning techniques, storage methods, and the ritual purification ceremonies that kept the vessels spiritually pure. A damaged or contaminated horn could not be used in sacred ceremonies until it had been properly restored and reconsecrated. Different types of ceremonies required different horn-passing protocols. Religious festivals followed patterns that honored specific gods and seasonal cycles. Political meetings used procedures that reflected the relative status of participants and the nature of the agreements being negotiated. Military celebrations employed rituals that emphasized warrior virtues and celebrated martial accomplishments. Each variation required participants to understand complex protocols that could trip up the inexperienced. The economics of ceremonial horns created networks of obligation and alliance that extended throughout Viking society. Lords competed to possess the most impressive horns, leading to elaborate gift exchanges and trading relationships that could span entire regions. A ruler who could present an ally with a magnificent horn was demonstrating both wealth and respect in ways that strengthened political bonds and created lasting obligations. Women played crucial roles in horn ceremonies that reflected their importance in Viking society beyond the domestic sphere. The lady of the hall often had the honor of presenting the first horn to the most important guest, a role that required diplomatic skills and detailed knowledge of proper protocols. Her selection of which horn to use and which guest to honor first could influence the evening's political dynamics and demonstrate her understanding of the complex relationships that defined her community. The morning after ceremonies involving sacred horns often revealed whether the rituals had been properly observed. Participants who remembered their words, honored their commitments, and showed no signs of regretting their ceremonial declarations were considered to have conducted themselves with honor. Those who claimed not to remember their statements or attempted to back away from obligations made while holding sacred horns faced social consequences that could damage their reputations permanently. Training young Vikings in proper horn protocols was considered essential education that prepared them for adult participation in society. Children observed ceremonies from an early age, learning the proper gestures, words, and behaviors that would be expected of them when they came of age. The first time a young person was invited to participate in a horn ceremony marked their transition to adult status and carried significance comparable to modern graduation ceremonies. The spiritual dimension of horn ceremonies connected participants to ancestral traditions and divine forces that governed their world. Vikings believed that drinking from horns used by their ancestors created direct connections to the wisdom and strength of the dead. The alcohol consumed during these ceremonies was thought to carry the essence of those who had drunk from the same vessels, creating a form of communion that transcended the boundaries between life and death. In the pantheon of Viking toasting traditions, certain subjects commanded such reverence that failing to honor them properly could result in divine retribution, social ostracism, or the kind of supernatural bad luck that followed families for generations. These weren't casual cheers offered over a friendly drink. They were sacred invocations that called upon the most powerful forces in the universe to witness, bless, and participate in mortal celebrations. The toast to Odin, the All-Father and Lord of Valhalla, was perhaps the most solemn and significant ritual in any Viking gathering. This wasn't a casual nod to the chief god. It was a formal acknowledgement of divine authority that required participants to demonstrate their worthiness through both their words and their conduct. The Odin toast typically opened formal ceremonies, establishing the sacred nature of the gathering and calling upon the god's wisdom to guide the proceedings that followed. When raising horns to honor Odin, participants would invoke his various names and attributes: Wotan, the Wanderer, the Raven God, the Lord of the Gallows, the Seeker of Wisdom. Each epithet carried specific meaning and called upon different aspects of the god's power. Warriors might emphasize his role as leader of the wild hunt, while skalds would invoke his association with poetry and wisdom. The choice of which aspects to honor revealed both the speaker's priorities and their understanding of divine power. The physical gesture of the Odin toast required participants to raise their drinking vessels high above their heads, reaching toward Asgard, where the god resided. This wasn't symbolic reaching. Vikings believed they were literally offering their alcohol to the god, sharing their precious mead or ale with the divine realm. Some of the drink would be spilled deliberately as an offering, while the remainder was consumed as a form of communion that created a temporary connection between mortal and divine. Toasts to Thor, the thunder god and protector of Midgard, carried different significance and attracted different types of participants. While Odin appealed to leaders, poets, and those who sought wisdom, Thor represented the common warrior, the farmer defending his land, and anyone who faced physical challenges that required strength and courage. Thor toasts were often more boisterous than those honoring Odin, reflecting the god's more approachable and straightforward nature. The thunder god's toasts frequently involved competitive drinking that tested participants' stamina and determination. Vikings believed that Thor himself enjoyed drinking contests and would smile upon those who demonstrated exceptional capacity for alcohol. These competitions weren't just entertainment. They were religious exercises that honored the god's legendary appetite and demonstrated the participants' worthiness to receive his protection. Ancestral toasts carried weight that extended far beyond simple memorial. They were believed to literally summon the spirits of the dead to participate in the celebration. Vikings maintained detailed genealogies that could stretch back 20 generations or more, and honoring ancestors required precise knowledge of names, deeds, and relationships that demonstrated respect for family history. Getting the genealogy wrong wasn't just embarrassing, it was spiritually dangerous and could offend the very ancestors being honored. The toast to fallen warriors was perhaps the most emotionally charged ceremony in Viking culture, combining grief, pride, and hope in a ritual that both honored the dead and comforted the living. These toasts weren't abstract memorials to unknown soldiers. They were specific remembrances of named individuals whose deeds, personalities, and final moments were recounted in detail that kept their memory alive and their spirits present among their surviving companions. Warrior toasts often involved the recitation of death poems verses that captured the essence of the fallen hero's character and accomplishments. These weren't maudlin eulogies that emphasized loss. They were celebrations of glorious death that reinforced cultural values about honor, courage, and the proper way to meet one's fate. A warrior who died well deserved to have his death commemorated in verse that would be repeated for generations. The ritual of the empty horn honored warriors who would never again participate in earthly celebrations. A drinking horn would be filled and placed in the position where the fallen hero would have sat, creating a physical presence that acknowledged their spiritual participation in the ceremony. This empty horn was never disturbed during the evening, serving as a constant reminder of loss and a symbol of the warrior's continued membership in the community of heroes. Ship toasts honored those lost at sea, a common fate in a maritime culture where voyages could disappear without trace into the grey waters of the North Atlantic. These ceremonies often involved floating small boats filled with mead or ale, sending offerings to the sea gods who controlled the fate of sailors. The liquid offerings were believed to purchase safe passage for future voyages and demonstrate respect for the power of the ocean. Religious toasts followed the calendar of seasonal festivals and holy days that marked the passage of time and honored the various gods who controlled different aspects of life and death. The winter solstice brought toasts to the sun's return and prayers for survival through the dark months ahead. Spring festivals honored the fertility gods who controlled the success of crops and livestock. Harvest celebrations thanked the gods for their bounty, while storing up divine favor for the challenges of winter. The toast to Freya, god of fertility and prosperity, was especially important during harvest festivals, when communities celebrated the success of their agricultural efforts. These toasts often involved elaborate ceremonies that included the blessing of newly harvested grain, the presentation of the first fruits to the gods, and communal drinking that celebrated the continuation of life through another seasonal cycle. Seasonal toasts reflected the precarious relationship between human survival and natural forces that could bring either abundance or destruction. Vikings understood that their existence depended on forces beyond their control: weather, soil fertility, animal health, and the complex interactions that determined whether communities would thrive or perish. Ritual toasts were attempts to influence these forces through demonstration of proper respect and acknowledgement of divine power. The spring toast to the renewal of life often involved the ceremonial drinking of the first mead made from honey gathered the previous season. This timing created a symbolic connection between the sweetness of the new year and the accumulated efforts of the previous year's labor. The honey had been transformed through fermentation, just as the year had been transformed through the seasons, creating a metaphorical link between human effort and natural process. Summer toasts celebrated the brief season when life was relatively easy and the harsh realities of survival temporarily relaxed. These were times for celebration, gratitude, and the kind of optimistic planning that was possible only when food was abundant and the weather was favorable. Summer drinking ceremonies often extended for days, creating community celebrations that strengthened social bonds and stored up happiness against the inevitable return of winter hardship. Autumn toasts carried the weight of preparation and the anxiety of approaching winter. These ceremonies honored the gods who controlled the harvest while asking for protection during the dark months ahead. The quality and quantity of the harvest determined not just physical survival, but the community's ability to maintain the social traditions that defined their identity. Poor harvests meant not just hunger, but the possible abandonment of the ceremonies that connected them to their gods and ancestors. Winter solstice toasts were perhaps the most desperate and hopeful ceremonies in the Viking calendar, combining acknowledgement of current hardship with faith in eventual renewal. These rituals often involved the burning of special fires and the consumption of precious stores of mead and ale that represented significant sacrifices during times when every calorie mattered for survival. The willingness to share scarce resources with the gods demonstrated faith that such sacrifice would be rewarded with divine protection. Viking wedding ceremonies transformed the simple act of two people getting married into elaborate multi-day festivals that combined romantic celebration with complex political negotiations, religious rituals, and enough communal drinking to cement alliances that could last for generations. These weren't intimate affairs attended by immediate family. They were public spectacles that involved entire communities and required diplomatic skills that would challenge modern wedding planners. The marriage feast wasn't just a celebration, it was a carefully orchestrated political event that formalized alliances between families, clans, and sometimes entire communities. The guest list itself was a diplomatic document that reflected political relationships, economic partnerships, and military alliances that extended far beyond the romantic preferences of the bride and groom. Failing to invite the right people could create lasting offenses that damaged relationships for decades. The ceremonial exchange of wedding horns was the centerpiece of Viking marriage rituals, a ceremony that combined romantic symbolism with legal contract making in ways that made the union both emotionally meaningful and politically binding. The bride and groom would drink from specially prepared horns that had been blessed by religious authorities and witnessed by representatives of both families. This shared drinking created bonds that were considered both sacred and legal, establishing a relationship that could only be dissolved under very specific circumstances. The selection of beverages for wedding toasts reflected the importance of the occasion and the wealth of the families involved. The finest mead was preferred for the most important toasts, with its honey sweetness symbolizing the hoped-for sweetness of the marital relationship. Special brews were often created specifically for weddings, with ingredients chosen for their symbolic properties as well as their flavor. Herbs associated with fertility, love, and prosperity were added to create unique beverages that existed nowhere else. Wedding drinking extended far beyond the formal ceremony to encompass days of celebration that gradually integrated the new couple into their changed social roles. The first night's feast honored the bride and groom as individuals making a life change. Subsequent celebrations recognized them as a new family unit with obligations and privileges that differed from their previous status. By the end of the extended celebration, the community had formally accepted the marriage, and the couple had demonstrated their ability to fulfill their new roles. The morning after traditions were crucial components of wedding celebrations that tested whether the previous night's festivities had been properly conducted. The bride and groom were expected to appear together, demonstrating that the marriage had been consummated and the relationship properly established. Their behavior, appearance, and interaction provided evidence of whether the marriage was likely to succeed and whether the community's investment in the celebration had been worthwhile. Funeral drinking traditions served the dual purpose of honoring the dead while providing psychological comfort to the living, creating ceremonies that combined grief with celebration in ways that helped communities process loss while maintaining social cohesion. These weren't somber affairs focused on mourning. They were complex rituals that acknowledged death while affirming the continuation of life and the enduring bonds that connected the living with the dead. The funeral feast often rivaled weddings in scale and significance, requiring enormous investments of resources that demonstrated the community's respect for the deceased, while providing opportunities for social interaction that helped survivors cope with their loss. The quantity and quality of alcohol served at funeral feasts reflected both the social status of the deceased and the wealth of their survivors, creating public displays that influenced community perceptions of family honor and social standing. Funeral toasts followed specific protocols that honored different aspects of the deceased's life and character. Warriors were toasted for their courage and martial accomplishments. Women were honored for their domestic skills and family contributions. Leaders were remembered for their wisdom and generosity. Each toast was expected to capture specific aspects of the person's character, while providing examples that reinforced community values and expectations. The final toast of a funeral feast was often directed to the deceased themselves, acknowledging their transition to the afterlife, while expressing hope for reunion in Valhalla or other appropriate destinations. This wasn't symbolic farewell. Vikings believed the dead could hear and respond to such communications, making funeral toasts actual conversations with spirits who retained interest in worldly affairs and the ability to influence events among the living. The concept of drinking luck permeated Viking culture like an invisible thread that connected every sip to cosmic forces capable of determining success, failure, and survival in a world where the margin between prosperity and disaster was measured in bushels of grain and the favor of unpredictable gods. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was a sophisticated system of belief that recognized the role of chance in human affairs while providing practical methods for influencing probability through proper ritual observance. Vikings understood that luck wasn't random. It was a resource that could be accumulated, spent, and shared through proper ceremonial drinking. Good luck could be enhanced by drinking with the right people, using the right vessels, and observing the proper protocols. Bad luck could be neutralized through ritual purification and the performance of ceremonies designed to restore divine favor. The key was understanding which actions attracted luck and which repelled it. Shared drinking was believed to distribute luck among participants, creating communities of fortune that rose and fell together. This belief encouraged generous hospitality and inclusive celebrations, while discouraging the kind of selfish behavior that could isolate individuals from the protective influence of group luck. A person who refused to share their good fortune through proper drinking protocols risked losing divine favor and facing future challenges without community support. The timing of ceremonial drinking was crucial for maximizing lucky outcomes, with certain times of day, phases of the moon, and seasonal periods being considered especially auspicious for different types of luck enhancement rituals. Morning toasts attracted different kinds of fortune than evening celebrations. Full moon ceremonies drew different cosmic influences than new moon rituals. Understanding these temporal variations required specialized knowledge that was passed down through generations of successful practitioners. Sacred drinking vessels were believed to accumulate luck through repeated ceremonial use, becoming increasingly powerful as they participated in successful rituals and favorable outcomes. Ancient horns that had been present at victorious battles, profitable trading expeditions, and successful harvests were considered especially potent tools for attracting good fortune. The ownership of such vessels was a form of inherited luck that provided competitive advantages in a world where success often depended on factors beyond human control. The morning after ceremonies designed to enhance drinking luck often revealed whether the rituals had been successful. Participants who woke feeling optimistic, energetic, and confident in their prospects were considered to have successfully attracted divine favor. Those who experienced hangovers, regret, or pessimism about the future understood that their luck enhancement efforts had failed, and additional ceremonies would be necessary to restore their spiritual balance. In the end, Viking drinking customs created a civilization that understood something modern society has largely forgotten, that shared intoxication, when properly channeled through ritual and ceremony, could transform individual strangers into unified communities capable of surviving and thriving in one of the world's most challenging environments. They proved that alcohol, properly used, it wasn't just a beverage, it was liquid social engineering that built the bonds strong enough to hold together a culture that would echo through history long after the last mead hall had burned and the final horn had been drained. If you think your worst drinking story involves waking up with a traffic cone and a vague memory of karaoke, Viking hangovers operated on an entirely different scale of regretone that typically involved blood feuds, exiled jarls, and the occasional accidental declaration of war. These weren't people who simply made poor decisions after a few too many. They were warriors who had systematically weaponized alcohol consumption and then discovered, often too late, that their own cultural traditions could be turned against them with devastating effectiveness. The Vikings had created a civilization where social advancement, political negotiation, and religious observance all required consuming potentially lethal quantities of alcohol, while maintaining the kind of judgment typically associated with Supreme Court justices and UN diplomats. It was a system that worked remarkably well until it didn't, at which point the consequences could range from mild embarrassment to the complete destruction of kingdoms. For a culture that prided itself on strategic thinking and careful planning, they had built a remarkable number of opportunities for catastrophically poor decision-making directly into their most important social institutions. The morning after a major feast often revealed that what had seemed like brilliant diplomacy, heroic challenges, and divinely inspired poetry, the night before had actually been a series of monumentally stupid mistakes made by people too drunk to realize they were sabotaging their own futures. Yet somehow, despite centuries of evidence that mixing alcohol with politics was roughly as advisable as juggling flaming axes, Vikings continued to conduct their most important business in environments specifically designed to impair judgment. The results were predictable, inevitable, and often spectacularly entertaining for everyone who hadn't participated in the previous evening's festivities. Viking drinking contests weren't casual bar competitions where the worst outcome was a bruised ego and a substantial bar tab. They were formal challenges that carried the weight of personal honor, political alliance, and divine favor, conducted by people who treated competitive alcohol consumption as a legitimate form of combat that could determine everything from trade agreements to marriage proposals. These contests combined the physical demands of extreme athletic performance with the intellectual challenges of maintaining dignity while slowly poisoning yourself into unconsciousness. The most legendary drinking contests became the stuff of saga literature, passed down through generations as cautionary tales disguised as entertainment. The contest between King Harold Hardrada and the Byzantine Emperor's champion supposedly lasted 3 days and ended with both participants requiring medical attention and a diplomatic crisis that nearly triggered a war. Archaeological evidence suggests this story, while possibly exaggerated, reflects the very real political importance that Viking society placed on demonstrated alcohol tolerance. The rules governing formal drinking contests were as complex as modern sporting regulations and twice as deadly. Participants had to consume identical quantities of identical beverages at identical intervals, with judges monitoring for cheating, dilution, or the various creative techniques that desperate competitors developed to maintain consciousness. Vomiting resulted in immediate disqualification and social disgrace. Falling unconscious meant defeat and potentially permanent damage to one's reputation. Winning required not just extraordinary physical tolerance, but the mental fortitude to continue making rational decisions while approaching alcohol poisoning. The beverages chosen for serious contests were specifically selected for their potency and their ability to incapacitate even experienced drinkers. Mead, aged for years until it achieved wine-strength alcohol content, was preferred for its smooth drinkability that concealed its devastating effects. Special brewing techniques created ales with alcohol concentrations that modern craft brewers would consider dangerous, using concentrated honey additions and extended fermentation periods that produced beverages more akin to liquor than beer. The physical preparation for major drinking contests resembled training for modern extreme sports, with experienced competitors developing techniques for managing alcohol consumption that would impress contemporary medical professionals. Some contestants practiced by gradually increasing their tolerance over months of preparation. Others developed elaborate pre-drinking rituals involving specific foods that were believed to slow alcohol absorption. A few relied on questionable folk remedies that ranged from mildly helpful to actively dangerous. The social implications of drinking contests extended far beyond personal bragging rights to encompass political alliances, economic partnerships, and military obligations that could affect entire communities. A lord who consistently lost drinking contests might find his authority questioned and his allies reconsidering their commitments. A merchant who could outdrink his competitors gained advantages in trade negotiations that could prove more valuable than superior products or competitive pricing. Drinking contests often served as substitutes for more violent forms of competition, allowing rivals to settle disputes through alcohol consumption rather than bloodshed. This represented a sophisticated form of conflict resolution that channeled aggressive impulses into relatively harmless competition. However, the definition of harmless was somewhat elastic, given that serious contests could result in alcohol poisoning, permanent health damage, or the kind of reputational destruction that made subsequent violence inevitable. The judging of drinking contests required officials with specialized knowledge of alcohol effects, human physiology, and the subtle signs that indicated when competition should be stopped before participants suffered permanent damage. Experienced judges developed the ability to recognize the difference between harmless intoxication and dangerous impairment, though their interventions weren't always welcomed by competitors who preferred risking death to accepting defeat. Women occasionally participated in drinking contests, though their competitions followed different rules that reflected both their social status and the recognition that female alcohol tolerance typically differed from male capacity. Female drinking champions were celebrated for their achievements and gained social influence that extended beyond typical gender roles. However, their participation also carried additional risks, as intoxicated women faced social vulnerabilities that their male counterparts didn't encounter. The aftermath of drinking contests could extend for days or weeks, as participants recovered from the physical effects of extreme alcohol consumption while dealing with the social and political consequences of their performance. Winners gained prestige and influence that could advance their careers and improve their prospects. Losers faced varying degrees of social penalty, from mild embarrassment to serious damage to their reputations and future opportunities. International drinking contests became diplomatic events that allowed different cultures to compete without resorting to warfare. Viking champions would challenge foreign visitors to contests that tested not just individual capacity, but cultural drinking traditions. These competitions served as forms of cultural exchange that sometimes prevented conflicts, while occasionally creating new sources of international tension. The medical understanding of alcohol's effects was primitive by modern standards, but Vikings developed practical knowledge of alcohol poisoning symptoms and basic treatment techniques. Contest officials learned to recognize the signs of dangerous intoxication and developed intervention methods that sometimes prevented deaths. However, their medical knowledge was limited, and serious contests periodically resulted in fatalities that were considered acceptable risks rather than preventable tragedies. The influence of alcohol on Viking political decision-making created a unique form of governance where the most important choices were often made by leaders whose judgment had been systematically impaired by the very substances that their culture considered essential for proper deliberation. This wasn't accidental. Vikings believed that alcohol enhanced wisdom, courage, and divine inspiration, making intoxicated decision-making not just acceptable, but spiritually necessary for proper leadership. Political negotiations conducted in mead halls followed protocols that combined diplomatic formality with progressive intoxication, creating a unique environment where initial sobriety gave way to increasingly impaired judgment as the evening progressed. Treaties, alliances, and major policy decisions were often finalized during the later stages of feasts, when alcohol had loosened inhibitions and created the kind of artificial camaraderie that made difficult agreements seem reasonable and mutually beneficial. The morning after revelation that significant political commitments had been made while drunk created ongoing diplomatic challenges that required specialized skills to manage. Viking leaders developed sophisticated techniques for honoring alcohol-induced agreements while minimizing their negative consequences. Some agreements were quietly renegotiated when sobriety revealed their impracticality. Others were honored despite their obvious flaws, leading to policies that seemed inexplicable to outside observers who hadn't witnessed their alcoholic origins. Royal decision-making was particularly vulnerable to alcohol-induced poor judgment, as kings and jarls were expected to demonstrate their leadership qualities through conspicuous consumption, while maintaining the mental clarity needed for complex political calculations. The combination of social pressure to drink heavily and the responsibility for making decisions that affected thousands of people created a perfect storm for catastrophically bad leadership choices. The famous case of King Eric Bloodaxe's decision to attack his own allies after a particularly intense feast demonstrates the potential consequences of alcohol-impaired royal judgment. The attack, launched in the pre-dawn hours after a night of heavy drinking, destroyed alliances that had taken years to build and ultimately contributed to Eric's loss of his kingdom. Contemporary accounts suggest that the king's decision-making was so obviously impaired that his own advisors attempted to intervene, but their efforts were unsuccessful due to Eric's intoxicated conviction that his strategy was brilliant. Military planning conducted under the influence of alcohol, created its own category of strategic disasters. As commanders who had consumed enough mead to float, a longship attempted to coordinate complex operations involving hundreds of warriors and multiple moving parts. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, which effectively ended the Viking Age, may have been influenced by pre-battle drinking that left Harold Hardrada's forces unprepared for the disciplined English response to their invasion. Economic policy decisions made while drunk had lasting consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect entire communities and trading networks. Tax policies, trade agreements, and resource allocation decisions made during feasts often reflected the optimistic overconfidence that alcohol produced rather than realistic assessment of available resources and market conditions. The morning after realization that unrealistic commitments had been made required diplomatic skills and creative accounting to manage. Legal decisions rendered by intoxicated judges created a unique form of jurisprudence where justice was influenced by alcohol consumption levels and the social dynamics of drinking gatherings. Viking legal systems acknowledged this reality by developing procedures for appealing decisions that were obviously influenced by impaired judgment, though proving that a judge had been too drunk to render proper justice required diplomatic skills and political connections. Marriage negotiations conducted while drunk produced unions that sometimes surprised both families when sobriety revealed the actual terms that had been agreed upon. Bridal prices, dowry arrangements, and the timing of ceremonies were often settled during the later stages of feasts, when alcohol had created artificial agreement among negotiating parties. The morning after these discussions sometimes revealed that entirely different marriages had been arranged than anyone had intended. International diplomacy conducted under the influence created legendary diplomatic incidents that were remembered for generations as examples of how alcohol could transform routine negotiations into historical catastrophes. The famous Burgundian wine incident, where a Viking embassy to Frankish courts resulted in accidentally declaring war on 3 different kingdoms during a single diplomatic dinner, became a cautionary tale that was recounted whenever alcohol and international relations intersected. The development of specialized roles for sober advisors reflected Viking recognition that important decisions required at least some participants whose judgment hadn't been compromised by alcohol consumption. These advisors were expected to remain relatively sober during important feasts, while maintaining the diplomatic fiction that they were participating fully in the drinking activities. Their interventions were crucial for preventing the worst alcohol-induced political disasters. Viking feasts were powder kegs of testosterone, sharp weapons, and enough alcohol to dissolve common sense, creating an environment where the smallest slight could escalate into bloodshed that transformed celebration into carnage within moments. These weren't modern bar fights that ended with bruised egos and calls to the police. They were explosions of violence that could leave dozens dead and create blood feuds that lasted for generations, all because someone drank from the wrong cup or sat in the wrong seat after consuming enough mead to pickle a whale. The combination of warrior culture, rigid social hierarchy, and systematic alcohol consumption created conditions where violence wasn't just possible, but almost inevitable during major gatherings. Vikings were trained from childhood to respond to insults with immediate physical retaliation, and alcohol amplified both the perception of insults and the intensity of responses. A gesture that might pass unnoticed during sober interaction could trigger lethal violence when filtered through the paranoid lens of extreme intoxication. Seating disputes were among the most common triggers for feast violence, as intoxicated guests became increasingly sensitive to perceived slights regarding their social status and honor. A warrior who discovered that his usual seat had been given to someone else might interpret this as a deliberate insult, requiring immediate, violent response. The resulting fights could spread throughout the hall as other guests were forced to choose sides based on their political allegiances and personal relationships. weapons protocols during feasts created an ongoing tension between the practical need for security and the cultural requirement that warriors maintain their martial identity. Most halls required guests to peace-bind their weapon-securing sword hilts and axe heads with leather thongs that would slow their deployment. But this system relied on honor and social pressure rather than actual disarmament. Seriously intoxicated warriors periodically ignored these protocols with predictably bloody results. The famous bloodbath at Roskilde, documented in multiple sagas, demonstrates how quickly feast violence could escalate beyond any possibility of control. What began as a disagreement over the serving order for mead escalated through several stages of verbal confrontation before exploding into violence that left over 30 dead and destroyed alliances that had taken decades to build. The incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing alcohol, weapons, and wounded pride in enclosed spaces. Women's safety during violent feast episodes was a constant concern that reflected both their vulnerable position and their importance to the social fabric of Viking communities. While women weren't typically direct targets of feast violence, they often became collateral damage when fights erupted around them. The murder of women during feast violence was considered especially heinous and typically triggered blood feuds that were more intense and longer-lasting than those arising from the deaths of male warriors. The architecture of mead halls was designed to minimize the damage from feast violence while accommodating the reality that such incidents were inevitable. Multiple exits allowed panicked guests to escape when violence erupted. Sturdy furniture was arranged to provide defensive positions and barriers that could slow the spread of fighting. Even the placement of the central hearth was calculated to provide both illumination that made surprise attacks difficult and a barrier that divided the hall into defensive zones. The intervention protocols during feast violence reflected Viking understanding that early action could sometimes prevent minor disagreements from escalating into major bloodbaths. Experienced hall guards were trained to recognize the warning signs of developing conflicts and to intervene before weapons were drawn. However, their effectiveness was limited by the same alcohol consumption that impaired everyone else's judgment, and their interventions weren't always successful. Post-violence cleanup involved more than simply removing bodies and cleaning blood from the floor. The political implications of feast violence required careful negotiation to prevent the immediate conflict from triggering larger wars between communities and families. Compensation payments, exile arrangements, and formal apologies had to be negotiated while dealing with the immediate trauma of violence and the ongoing effects of alcohol consumption. The legal system that developed around feast violence reflected Viking understanding that alcohol-impaired judgment required different standards of accountability than sober criminal behavior. Killings committed during feast violence were often treated as manslaughter rather than murder, with reduced penalties that acknowledged the role of alcohol in impairing the perpetrator's judgment. However, this leniency was balanced by the requirement that compensation be paid to the victim's family and that the perpetrator accept responsibility for their actions. The psychological impact of feast violence extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect entire communities that had witnessed or heard about the bloodshed. Children who saw respected warriors transformed into blood-soaked killers by alcohol developed complex relationships with both violence and drinking that influenced their own behavior as adults. The normalization of feast violence created a culture where such incidents were expected rather than shocking. International incidents arising from feast violence created diplomatic challenges that could affect relationships between kingdoms and cultures. When foreign guests were killed during feast violence, their home communities often demanded compensation or revenge that could trigger larger conflicts. The diplomatic protocols for managing such incidents required specialized knowledge of both local customs and international law. The development of alternative feast arrangements reflected Viking efforts to maintain their drinking traditions while reducing the likelihood of violence. Some communities experimented with weapon-free celebrations, though these were often considered less prestigious than traditional armed feasts. Others developed elaborate protocols for managing conflicts that arose during celebrations, creating formalized procedures for resolving disputes without bloodshed. Training young warriors to manage alcohol consumption while maintaining self-control became an essential component of Viking education, as the ability to drink heavily without becoming violent was considered a mark of maturity and leadership potential. Warriors who consistently became violent when drunk found their advancement opportunities limited, as leaders recognized that such behavior created unnecessary risks for their communities. The legendary regrets documented in Viking sagas read like a medieval collection of "what was I thinking" moments, except these weren't harmless embarrassments about drunk texting or inappropriate karaoke performances. They were life-altering catastrophes that destroyed kingdoms, ended marriages, and created blood feuds that lasted for generations. The sagas preserve these moments of alcohol-induced poor judgment with the kind of unflinching detail that suggests Viking society was simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the capacity of mead and ale to transform intelligent leaders into spectacular examples of bad decision-making. The saga of Burnt Njal contains perhaps the most famous example of mourning after political regret in Viking literature, describing how Gunnar of Hliddarendi's drunken boast about his ability to defeat any challenger led directly to a series of confrontations that ultimately resulted in his death and the destruction of his family. The saga's author documents Gunnar's progressive realization that his alcohol-induced overconfidence had committed him to a course of action that would end in disaster, creating a narrative arc that serves as both entertainment and cautionary tale. Marriage proposals made while drunk created their own category of saga literature, as intoxicated suitors committed themselves to unions that seemed considerably less attractive when viewed through the clear lens of sobriety. The story of Olaf, the peacock's drunken proposal to 3 different women during a single feast, demonstrates how alcohol could transform careful marriage politics into diplomatic disasters that required years to untangle. The morning after negotiations between the families involved created precedents for managing alcohol-induced marital commitments that were referenced for generations. Economic commitments made under the influence of alcohol feature prominently in sagas as examples of how poor judgment could destroy carefully accumulated wealth within a single evening. The tale of Egil Skallagrimsson's father giving away an entire herd of cattle during a drinking contest illustrates how alcohol could overcome the kind of economic caution that was essential for survival in Viking society. The family's subsequent poverty and the social consequences of this generosity provide a narrative framework for examining the long-term effects of short-term poor judgment. Religious commitments made while drunk created unique problems that required both theological interpretation and practical management. The saga literature includes multiple examples of intoxicated individuals making vows to undertake pilgrimages, build temples, or dedicate significant resources to religious purposes. The morning after question of whether such commitments were binding created legal and theological debates that influenced Viking understanding of the relationship between alcohol and spiritual obligation. Military commitments made under the influence of alcohol appear throughout saga literature as cautionary tales about the dangers of mixing strategic planning with mead consumption. The famous example of King Olaf Tryggvason's drunken promise to attack Norway with insufficient forces demonstrates how alcohol could override the kind of military judgment that was essential for survival in Viking warfare. The subsequent disaster at the Battle of Svolder serves as a case study in how poor decision-making could have consequences that extended far beyond the individual leader. The literary treatment of drinking regrets reveals Viking attitudes toward personal responsibility and the role of alcohol in moral judgment. Saga authors consistently portray their heroes as ultimately responsible for their drunken decisions, while acknowledging the role of alcohol in impairing judgment. This balance reflects a culture that understood the dangers of alcohol, while maintaining its central role in social and religious life. Family relationships, destroyed by alcohol-induced poor judgment, form a recurring theme in saga literature, as intoxicated individuals made decisions that damaged the kinship bonds that were essential for survival in Viking society. The story of Thorkel, the High's drunken insult to his own brother, illustrates how alcohol could override family loyalty and create conflicts that divided entire clans. The subsequent blood feud and its resolution provide a template for understanding how Viking families managed internal conflicts created by poor judgment. Professional relationships damaged by drinking-related poor judgment created economic and social consequences that could affect entire communities. The saga literature includes examples of craftsmen, merchants, and farmers whose drunken behavior destroyed business relationships that had taken years to build. These stories serve as cautionary tales about the importance of maintaining professional dignity even during celebrations. The documentation of regret in saga literature serves multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment, providing both moral instruction and practical guidance for managing the consequences of poor judgment. The detailed accounts of how various characters dealt with their alcohol-induced mistakes create a handbook for damage control that was referenced by subsequent generations facing similar challenges. International regrets created diplomatic incidents that required specialized knowledge to resolve, as drunken insults to foreign dignitaries could trigger conflicts between kingdoms. The saga accounts of such incidents provide insight into the diplomatic protocols that developed for managing alcohol-related international embarrassments, while maintaining the essential relationships that supported Viking trade. Political networks. The morning after realization that significant life changes had been triggered by alcohol-induced decisions created a unique form of Viking literature that combined personal reflection with social commentary. These accounts provide insight into individual psychology while documenting the social mechanisms that Viking communities developed for managing the consequences of poor judgment. At the extreme end of Viking drinking culture lay the ultimate consequences: exile and death, not from enemy action or natural disaster, but from the very social customs that defined civilized behavior. These weren't abstract theoretical risks. They were documented realities that claimed the lives and destroyed the futures of individuals who had simply failed to navigate the treacherous intersection of alcohol, social expectations, and personal judgment with sufficient skill. Exile, the social death that preceded physical death, was often the inevitable result of drinking-related behavior that violated the fundamental bonds holding Viking communities together. A warrior who killed the wrong person during feast violence, a leader whose drunken decisions bankrupted his followers, or a family member whose alcohol-induced actions brought shame upon their kinsmen, could find themselves formally expelled from the only society they had ever known. Exile wasn't just punishment. It was a sentence of slow death in a world where survival required community support. The process of exile typically began with a formal assembly where the accused individual's drinking-related crimes were recounted in detail before the entire community. These weren't casual proceedings, but legal rituals that followed established procedures, designed to ensure that exile was justified and properly documented. The community needed to establish that the individual's behavior was so egregious that their continued presence posed an unacceptable threat to social order and community survival. The practical mechanics of exile involved the formal severing of all social and economic relationships that had previously sustained the condemned individual. Family members were required to disown them, business partners had to terminate all agreements, and former friends were expected to refuse any assistance or contact. This social isolation was designed to make survival so difficult that exile became effective, even if the condemned individual remained physically present in familiar territory. Exiled individuals faced immediate practical challenges that often proved insurmountable without community support. Shelter, food, protection, and the basic necessities of survival all depended on social relationships that exile had destroyed. The exiled person became a non-person, invisible to their former community, and unwelcome in neighboring settlements that had been informed of their crimes and punishment. The psychological impact of exile was often more devastating than the physical hardships, as individuals who had defined themselves through their relationships and social roles suddenly found themselves completely alone in a world that no longer acknowledged their existence. Many exiled Vikings chose death over the psychological torture of complete social isolation, seeing suicide as preferable to the slow degradation of trying to survive without community support. Death, directly resulting from drinking-related incidents, took multiple forms that reflected the various ways alcohol could prove fatal in Viking society. Alcohol poisoning during competitive drinking was perhaps the most straightforward cause, as contestants pushed their bodies beyond safe limits in pursuit of social glory and political advantage. These deaths were often considered honorable, as they resulted from the pursuit of cultural values rather than weakness or poor judgment. Violence during drinking sessions claimed more lives than alcohol poisoning, as intoxicated warriors lost the self-control that normally prevented minor disagreements from escalating to lethal violence. The combination of weapons, alcohol, and wounded pride created conditions where social interactions could turn deadly within moments. These deaths were harder to categorize morally, as they often resulted from poor judgment rather than intentional malice. The morning after suicides that followed particularly catastrophic drinking episodes represented a unique category of alcohol-related death that reflected the intersection of personal shame and social consequences. Warriors who had disgraced themselves through drunken behavior sometimes chose death over living with the social consequences of their actions. These suicides were often considered more honorable than attempting to rebuild damaged reputations through continued life. Accidental deaths resulting from impaired judgment claimed victims who made poor decisions about navigation, safety, or basic survival while under the influence of alcohol. Falling off ships, wandering into dangerous territory, or simply freezing to death after passing out in inappropriate locations were common ways that alcohol consumption proved fatal. These deaths were typically considered unfortunate rather than honorable, as they reflected poor judgment rather than the pursuit of cultural values. The documentation of alcohol-related deaths in Viking society provides insight into the statistical reality of a culture that had systematically integrated dangerous levels of alcohol consumption into its most important social institutions. While exact numbers are impossible to determine, saga literature and archaeological evidence suggest that alcohol-related deaths were common enough to be considered normal rather than exceptional. The legal and social frameworks that developed around alcohol-related deaths reflected Viking understanding that such fatalities were inevitable consequences of their cultural practices rather than aberrant incidents requiring systemic change. Compensation systems, revenge protocols, and social support mechanisms all accommodated the reality that drinking customs would periodically result in deaths that required community management. The religious interpretation of alcohol-related deaths varied depending on the circumstances and the deceased individual's social status. Deaths resulting from honorable competition or the pursuit of cultural values were often considered evidence of divine favor, while deaths resulting from poor judgment or dishonorable behavior were interpreted as divine punishment. This theological framework helped communities process the moral implications of their drinking customs. The impact of alcohol-related deaths on families and communities extended far beyond the immediate loss, as these fatalities often triggered blood feuds, inheritance disputes, and social realignments that could affect generations. The death of a leader due to drinking-related causes could destabilize entire communities, while the death of a young warrior represented the loss of future protection and productivity. Prevention efforts focused on education and social pressure rather than systematic changes to drinking customs, as Viking society was unwilling to abandon cultural practices that were considered essential to their identity. Young people were taught to recognize the warning signs of dangerous intoxication and to intervene when necessary, though the effectiveness of such education was limited by the same cultural values that made excessive drinking socially necessary. The long-term consequences of alcohol-related deaths included the gradual selection for individuals who possessed either exceptional alcohol tolerance or superior judgment about when to stop drinking. This evolutionary pressure may have contributed to the development of cultural practices that balance the social benefits of drinking with the practical necessity of survival. Though the process was costly in terms of human lives and social stability, in the end, the Viking experience with alcohol-induced catastrophe serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of building a civilization around practices that systematically impair judgment while requiring its exercise. Their society created elaborate systems for managing the consequences of poor decisions while maintaining the cultural practices that made such decisions inevitable. It was a solution that worked well enough to sustain their civilization for centuries, though at a cost measured in exile, blood, and the kind of mourning after regrets that echo through literature for 1,000 years. Perhaps the most sobering lesson of Viking drinking culture is that even the most sophisticated society can fall victim to its own success in creating traditions that are simultaneously essential and destructive. A lesson that resonates in any culture where social customs and human judgment intersect with potentially catastrophic results. If you think it's hard to watch your favorite bar close down, imagine being a Viking, watching an entire civilization's worth of epic drinking traditions slowly transform into polite dinner parties where the strongest beverage served was watered-down ale, and the most scandalous behavior involved someone forgetting to say grace before the meal. This wasn't a sudden apocalyptic end to Norse drinking culture, no dramatic moment where someone declared mead halls illegal and hauled away the ceremonial horns. Instead, it was a slow, almost imperceptible fade, like watching a magnificent bonfire gradually burn down to barely glowing embers, while everyone pretended not to notice that the party was definitively over. The decline of Viking drinking culture was essentially a case study in how civilizations can evolve themselves out of their own defining characteristics, trading the wild, dangerous, gloriously excessive traditions that had made them legendary for the kind of respectable social customs that ensured survival, but eliminated most of the fun. It was progress, undoubtedly, but the kind of progress that left former Vikings staring wistfully at their dusty drinking horns while attending church services where communion wine was carefully measured in thimble-sized portions. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't imposed by foreign conquerors who simply banned all the good stuff. Instead, it emerged from a complex interaction of religious conversion, economic evolution, political centralization, and the gradual realization that maintaining a civilization based on competitive drinking and ritual intoxication was, perhaps, not the most sustainable long-term strategy for success in medieval Europe. The Vikings had built a culture around alcohol consumption that was magnificent, terrifying, and ultimately incompatible with the kind of organized, predictable society that was emerging around them. The arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia didn't immediately transform Viking drinking culture so much as it slowly, systematically, and somewhat apologetically undermined every theological justification that had made epic alcohol consumption not just acceptable, but spiritually necessary. This wasn't a dramatic conversion moment where missionaries burst into mead halls and smashed drinking horns while delivering fiery sermons about temperance. Instead, it was a gradual theological reframing that made traditional Viking drinking customs seem less like divine communion and more like, well, getting spectacularly drunk while claiming religious motivation. Christianity arrived in Scandinavia, carrying its own complex relationship with alcohol. Wine was literally the blood of Christ, after all, and monasteries were among the most sophisticated brewers in medieval Europe. The problem wasn't that Christians opposed alcohol consumption entirely. It was that they had fundamentally different ideas about when, why, and how much drinking was appropriate. Where Vikings saw mead as a medium for divine communication that required consumption in quantities sufficient to achieve altered consciousness, Christians viewed alcohol as a gift to be consumed in moderation, while maintaining clear judgment and moral responsibility. The theological implications of this shift were profound and far-reaching. Viking drinking culture had been built on the premise that alcohol enhanced wisdom, courage, and spiritual insight by bringing drinkers closer to the gods, who themselves were enthusiastic consumers of mead and ale. Christian theology, however, emphasized the importance of maintaining rational judgment and moral clarity, viewing excessive intoxication as a barrier to spiritual development rather than a pathway to divine understanding. This wasn't just a difference of opinion about drinking customs. It was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of spiritual experience and human responsibility. Early Christian missionaries in Scandinavia demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill in managing this theological collision, recognizing that directly attacking drinking customs would likely result in their own rapid martyrdom rather than successful conversion. Instead, they focused on gradually reframing the moral context of alcohol consumption, emphasizing Christian virtues like moderation, self-control, and concern for community welfare that made excessive drinking seem selfish and spiritually immature rather than heroic and divinely inspired. The transformation of sacred spaces reflected this changing relationship with alcohol as Christian churches gradually displaced mead halls as the primary centers of community life. Churches offered many of the same social functions as traditional halls: community gathering, ceremonial celebration, political discussion, but within an architectural and theological framework that emphasized different values. Where mead halls had been designed to facilitate epic drinking sessions, churches were built to promote contemplation, worship, and the kind of sober reflection that was difficult to achieve while consuming heroic quantities of fermented beverages. The ritual calendar of Christianity created new patterns of celebration that competed with traditional Viking drinking festivals. Christian holy days offered alternative occasions for community gathering that emphasized religious observance rather than competitive alcohol consumption. While these celebrations often included festive drinking, the quantities and contexts were carefully controlled to maintain the dignity appropriate for religious observance. The wild, multi-day bacchanals that had characterized traditional Viking festivals gradually gave way to more restrained celebrations that balanced enjoyment with spiritual propriety. The concept of sin, largely foreign to traditional Viking moral thinking, introduced new frameworks for evaluating drinking behavior that made excess consumption morally problematic rather than socially prestigious. Vikings had traditionally viewed drinking capacity as a form of personal strength and social virtue. Christianity reframed excessive drinking as a form of weakness that demonstrated lack of self-control and insufficient concern for moral duty. This shift didn't happen immediately, but over generations, it fundamentally altered how Scandinavian communities evaluated and responded to drinking behavior. Confession and penance systems created formal mechanisms for addressing drinking-related misconduct that replaced traditional Viking approaches to managing alcohol-induced poor judgment. Where Viking society had handled drinking problems through compensation payments, public shame, or occasionally violence, Christian communities developed confession rituals that emphasized personal responsibility, genuine repentance, and spiritual reformation. These systems were often more effective at changing behavior than traditional punishments, though they fundamentally altered the social dynamics surrounding alcohol consumption. The gradual adoption of Christian marriage customs transformed one of the most important drinking-centered ceremonies in Viking culture. Traditional Viking weddings had been multi-day celebrations that emphasized alliance building through elaborate drinking rituals. Christian marriages emphasized the spiritual union of two individuals within a framework that discouraged excessive consumption. While wedding celebrations continued to include drinking, the context and purpose had fundamentally changed from political theater to religious ceremony. Monastic brewing traditions introduced new approaches to alcohol production that emphasized quality over quantity and craftsmanship over potency. Christian monasteries became centers of brewing innovation that developed techniques for creating more refined beverages designed for moderate consumption rather than epic drinking contests. These brewing traditions gradually influenced secular production, creating markets for sophisticated beverages that were appreciated for their flavor rather than their ability to incapacitate large numbers of people simultaneously. The Christian emphasis on literacy and written records began to displace the oral traditions that had been preserved and transmitted through drinking ceremonies. Where Viking culture had relied on intoxicated skalds to maintain historical memory and cultural knowledge, Christian communities developed written texts that could preserve information more reliably than human memory enhanced by alcohol consumption. This shift gradually reduced the social importance of drinking gatherings as educational and cultural events. The transformation of leadership roles reflected changing expectations about the relationship between authority and alcohol consumption. Christian kingship emphasized moral responsibility, rational judgment, and divine appointment, rather than the personal charisma and drinking prowess that had characterized traditional Viking leadership. While Christian kings certainly drank, they were expected to maintain the kind of consistent moral behavior that was difficult to achieve while regularly consuming enough alcohol to demonstrate their worthiness through competitive drinking. The theological concept of individual salvation introduced new priorities that competed with communal drinking traditions. Where Viking culture had emphasized collective celebration and shared experience as pathways to spiritual fulfillment, Christianity emphasized individual moral development and personal relationship with God. This shift gradually reduced the importance of communal drinking as a spiritual practice, while elevating private devotion and personal moral discipline. The architectural transformation of Scandinavian communities reflected broader social changes that gradually undermined the centrality of communal drinking in daily life. The great mead halls that had dominated Viking settlements slowly gave way to smaller, more private structures that accommodated different patterns of social interaction and reflected changing priorities about community life and individual privacy. This wasn't simply a matter of changing building styles. It represented a fundamental shift in how people lived, worked, and related to each other. The decline of the Great Hall, as the center of community life, began with practical considerations that gradually accumulated into cultural transformation. Maintaining a large hall required enormous resources, massive amounts of timber, skilled craftsmen, ongoing maintenance, and the constant supply of food and drink necessary to justify the building's existence. As economic conditions changed and alternative social structures emerged, the cost-benefit analysis of great hall construction began to favor smaller, more efficient alternatives. The rise of individual households as primary social units reflected changing economic patterns that made extended family groups less necessary for survival and success. Where Viking society had organized around large kinship groups that required communal spaces for coordination and celebration, emerging economic systems favored smaller, more flexible family units that could adapt quickly to changing opportunities and challenges. Individual households didn't need great halls. They needed efficient, manageable spaces that supported their specific activities and goals. The development of specialized buildings for different functions gradually replaced the multi-purpose Great Hall with structures designed for specific activities. Churches provided spaces for religious ceremony and community gathering. Markets offered venues for commercial activity. Craft workshops accommodated specialized production. These purpose-built structures were often more efficient for their intended uses than the great halls that had previously accommodated all community functions within a single massive building. Urban development patterns encouraged the construction of multiple, smaller buildings rather than single large structures, as cities favored density and efficiency over the kind of monumental architecture that had characterized rural Viking settlements. Urban dwellers needed housing that accommodated small family units, while providing easy access to work, markets, and social activities. The Great Hall model was poorly suited to urban life, where space was expensive and multiple functions required specialized facilities. Changes in heating technology made smaller buildings more practical and comfortable than the massive halls that had previously been necessary for efficient warming. Improved chimney design, better insulation techniques, and more efficient heating systems allowed families to maintain comfortable living conditions in smaller spaces without requiring the communal fires that had made great halls economically necessary. Individual households could now provide adequate warmth without sharing resources with extended community groups. The shift toward private property ownership undermined the communal resource sharing that had made great halls economically viable. When land, livestock, and other assets were owned individually rather than collectively, families had less incentive to participate in the communal activities that had justified the expense of maintaining large gathering spaces. Private ownership encouraged investment in individual household improvements rather than communal facilities that served broader community needs. Women's changing roles influenced household architecture as domestic work became more specialized and family-centered rather than community-focused. The elaborate food preparation required for great hall feasts was gradually replaced by smaller-scale cooking that could be managed within individual households. This shift made dedicated kitchen spaces more valuable than the large, multi-purpose areas that had characterized traditional great halls. The decline of warrior culture reduced the need for spaces designed to accommodate large groups of armed men and their elaborate social rituals. Peaceful communities didn't require the kind of ceremonial spaces that had been necessary for managing warrior hierarchies and coordinating military activities. Smaller gathering spaces could accommodate the social needs of communities focused on farming, crafting, and trade rather than warfare and raiding. Storage and security considerations favored smaller buildings that could be more easily defended and monitored than massive halls that required substantial resources to protect. Individual households could secure their own possessions more effectively than communal storage systems, reducing the need for large, centralized facilities that had previously housed community resources and required collective defense. The transformation of social ceremonies adapted to smaller spaces and more intimate gatherings rather than the massive community celebrations that had required great halls. Weddings, funerals, and religious observances could be conducted in churches, private homes, or smaller community buildings that were more appropriate for the scale of activities that characterized peaceful agricultural communities. The economic foundations of Viking drinking culture gradually eroded as the sources of wealth that had funded elaborate feasting shifted toward forms of prosperity that didn't require or reward conspicuous alcohol consumption. The transformation from a warrior economy based on raiding and tribute to a more stable system based on agriculture, trade, and craft production fundamentally altered the economic incentives that had made epic drinking both affordable and socially necessary. The raiding economy that had provided the surplus wealth necessary for elaborate feasting was inherently unsustainable, depending on the availability of targets that could be successfully attacked without overwhelming retaliation. As European kingdoms developed better defenses, and more effective military coordination, Viking raiding became increasingly dangerous and less profitable. The decline of raiding income forced Scandinavian communities to develop alternative economic strategies that didn't generate the kind of sudden wealth windfalls that had funded legendary drinking celebrations. Agricultural intensification required different patterns of resource allocation that favored long-term investment over immediate consumption. Farmers needed to save seed grain, maintain livestock, and invest in land improvements that would increase future productivity. This economic discipline was fundamentally incompatible with the traditional practice of converting surplus resources into spectacular drinking festivals that consumed enormous quantities of food and alcohol without producing any lasting economic benefit. Trade-based prosperity encouraged different social behaviors that emphasized reliability, reputation, and long-term relationship building over the dramatic gestures and competitive displays that had characterized warrior culture. Merchants needed to maintain consistent quality, honor their commitments, and demonstrate the kind of sober judgment that inspired confidence in business partners. The reputation for epic drinking that had enhanced warrior status could actually damage commercial credibility and reduce trading opportunities. Craft production required steady work habits and consistent quality that were difficult to maintain while participating in the irregular binge drinking cycles that had characterized traditional Viking social life. Skilled craftsmen needed to maintain their tools, preserve their materials, and produce consistent output that met customer expectations. The unpredictable schedule of traditional drinking celebrations was incompatible with the disciplined work habits required for successful craft production. Population growth created economic pressures that made the conspicuous consumption of traditional feasting increasingly difficult to justify. When communities had been small and resources relatively abundant, converting surplus wealth into drinking celebrations had been economically feasible. As populations grew and resources became more scarce, the same resources could be used more efficiently for investment, trade, or supporting larger numbers of people at basic subsistence levels. Monetary systems gradually replaced barter economies in ways that made the economics of feasting more transparent and economically questionable. When wealth was measured in cattle, grain, or other consumable goods, converting it into drinking celebrations seemed like a reasonable use of perishable resources. When wealth was measured in coins that could be saved, invested, or used for future purchases, spending large amounts on temporary celebrations became more difficult to justify economically. Tax systems developed by emerging kingdoms created new economic obligations that competed with traditional feast expenditures for available resources. Kings needed steady income to maintain armies, build infrastructure, and support administrative systems. These royal demands for taxation reduced the surplus wealth available for private celebrations, while creating alternative claims on community resources that were often enforced more effectively than traditional social obligations. International trade created opportunities for profitable investment that offered better returns than the social capital generated by traditional feasting. Merchants who invested their wealth in trade goods, ships, or commercial partnerships could generate ongoing income that exceeded the temporary social benefits of elaborate drinking celebrations. The opportunity cost of traditional feasting became increasingly apparent as alternative uses of wealth proved more profitable. Market integration meant that resources used for local celebrations could often be sold for significant profit to distant customers who valued them more highly than local consumers. Grain that might have been brewed into ale for feast consumption could be sold to urban markets at prices that made brewing seem economically wasteful. This market integration gradually shifted resource allocation away from local consumption toward external trade. Specialization of labor created communities where different individuals contributed different skills and resources rather than participating equally in communal celebrations. When everyone had been warriors or farmers with similar economic roles, communal feasting had made social and economic sense. When communities included specialized craftsmen, traders, and service providers with different economic interests and schedules, organizing community-wide celebrations became more complicated and less beneficial for all participants. The gradual transformation of Viking warriors into farmers and merchants represented one of history's most successful career transition programs. Even though it wasn't voluntary, and most of the participants would have preferred to keep their previous jobs, this wasn't a simple matter of hanging up the battle axe and picking up a plow. It was a fundamental reimagining of masculine identity, social status, and life purpose that required abandoning most of the cultural values that had defined Viking civilization for centuries. The warrior-to-farmer transition was driven primarily by economic necessity rather than personal preference, as the traditional sources of warrior income gradually disappeared while agricultural opportunities expanded. The most successful raids had always targeted communities that possessed valuable resources but lacked effective defenses. As European kingdoms developed better military organization and more sophisticated fortification techniques, the risk-reward ratio of raiding shifted decisively against the raiders. Viking warriors discovered that their traditional profession was becoming not just dangerous, but economically unviable. Agricultural work required a completely different skill set than warfare, demanding patience, planning, and steady application of effort, rather than the explosive violence and dramatic risk-taking that had characterized warrior culture. Farmers needed to understand soil conditions, weather patterns, crop rotation, and animal husbandry knowledge that was completely unrelated to the weapons training, tactical thinking, and personal combat skills that had defined warrior excellence. The transition required essentially starting over in a completely different profession at an age when most people expected to be experts in their chosen field. The social status implications of this transition were psychologically devastating for many former warriors who had defined their identities through martial accomplishment and social recognition of their fighting abilities. Viking society had traditionally viewed farming as necessary but unexciting work performed by people who lacked the courage and skill for warrior careers. Accepting farmer status meant acknowledging that their warrior careers had ended not in glorious death, but in economic obsolescence. Land ownership patterns encouraged the warrior-to-farmer transition by offering former raiders opportunities to acquire property that could provide steady income through agricultural production. Many warriors had accumulated wealth during their raiding careers that could be invested in land, livestock, and agricultural equipment. While farming offered lower potential returns than successful raiding, it also involved much lower risks and provided predictable income that could support families and communities over the long term. The development of agricultural technology made farming more attractive to former warriors by reducing the physical demands and increasing the potential profitability of agricultural work. Improved plows, better harvesting techniques, and more efficient processing methods allowed farmers to produce larger crops with less physical labor. These technological improvements made agriculture seem more compatible with the kind of strategic thinking and problem-solving skills that warriors had developed during their military careers. Military skills occasionally proved transferable to agricultural work, particularly in areas like land clearing, construction, and animal management that required physical strength and organizational ability. Former warriors often became community leaders in agricultural development projects that required coordination of group efforts and strategic planning. Their leadership experience, while gained in military contexts, proved valuable for organizing agricultural communities and coordinating complex farming operations. The merchant career path attracted warriors who had developed trading skills during their raiding careers, as successful raids often involved negotiating with victims, evaluating valuable goods, and managing complex logistical operations. Many Viking warriors had gained commercial experience through the legitimate trade that often accompanied raiding expeditions. These commercial skills could be directly transferred to peaceful trading careers that offered opportunities for travel, adventure, and substantial profit without the risks associated with raiding. Craft production offered career opportunities for warriors who had developed specialized skills in metalworking, woodworking, or other technical areas that were essential for maintaining weapons and equipment. The transition from making weapons for personal use to producing goods for sale required developing new marketing and quality control skills, but the basic technical abilities were often transferable. Some former warriors became highly successful craftsmen whose products were valued throughout Scandinavia and beyond. The marriage market influenced career transitions as women increasingly preferred partners who could provide steady income and stable family life, rather than the excitement and uncertainty associated with warrior careers. Former warriors who successfully transitioned to farming or merchant careers often found that their new economic stability made them more attractive marriage partners, providing additional incentives for career change beyond simple economic necessity. Religious conversion supported the warrior to civilian transition by providing new frameworks for masculine identity that emphasized different virtues than traditional warrior culture. Christian concepts of good husbandry, honest work, and community service offered alternative sources of social recognition that didn't require martial accomplishment. Former warriors could gain respect through success in peaceful pursuits without feeling that they had abandoned their masculine identity. Training programs developed informally within communities as successful farmers and merchants shared their knowledge with former warriors who were attempting career transitions. These educational efforts were often supported by communities that recognized the benefits of helping former warriors develop productive civilian skills rather than allowing them to become social problems. The success of these informal education systems demonstrated the adaptability of former warriors when provided with appropriate support and training opportunities. Despite the remarkable success of Viking drinking culture's transformation into the moderate, socially responsible alcohol customs of modern Scandinavia, certain stubborn genetic predispositions and cultural memories have persisted with the kind of determination that would have impressed their mead-consuming ancestors. If you've ever wondered why modern Scandinavians approach alcohol with such systematic thoroughness, carefully planned drinking sessions, elaborate toasting protocols, and the ability to consume impressive quantities while maintaining perfect social composure, you're witnessing the evolutionary result of 1,000 years of cultural selection pressure that favored people who could drink seriously without destroying their lives or careers. The modern Scandinavian relationship with alcohol reflects a sophisticated synthesis of Viking drinking traditions and Christian temperance values that has created some of the world's most successful alcohol management systems. Contemporary Nordic countries combine generous alcohol consumption with remarkably low rates of alcohol-related social problems, suggesting that they've learned to preserve the social benefits of their drinking heritage while avoiding most of the catastrophic consequences that had made Viking drinking culture both legendary and ultimately unsustainable. State monopoly systems in countries like Sweden and Norway represent perhaps the most Viking-like approach to alcohol regulation in the modern world. Centralized control, systematic distribution, and careful management of consumption patterns that would have been recognizable to any medieval jarl who had successfully managed his community's drinking supplies. These systems combine respect for alcohol's social importance with recognition of its potential dangers, creating frameworks that allow serious drinking while preventing the kind of social disruption that could destroy communities. The persistence of elaborate toasting traditions in modern Scandinavian social customs demonstrates the enduring influence of Viking ceremonial drinking, though the contexts and purposes have evolved considerably. Contemporary Scandinavian toasts still follow complex protocols that reflect social hierarchy and demonstrate respect for shared values, but the beverages involved are more likely to be aquavit or beer than mead, and the quantities consumed are calibrated to enhance social interaction rather than achieve religious transcendence or political alliance. Midsummer celebrations and other seasonal festivals throughout Scandinavia retain elements of the ancient drinking customs that once marked the passage of time and honored the natural forces that controlled agricultural success. While modern celebrations emphasize family gathering and community solidarity rather than religious communion with pagan gods, the underlying structure of these events should consumption of special beverages, ceremonial toasts, and collective celebration of seasonal transitions clearly descends from Viking traditions. The Scandinavian sauna culture represents an interesting adaptation of communal gathering traditions that originally centered around drinking, but have evolved to emphasize different forms of shared experience and social bonding. While alcohol consumption often accompanies sauna sessions, the primary focus has shifted to the shared endurance of heat and cold rather than the shared consumption of fermented beverages. This evolution demonstrates how cultural traditions can maintain their social functions while adapting to changing health awareness and social priorities. Modern Scandinavian brewing traditions combine ancient techniques with contemporary quality control to produce beverages that would be recognizable to Viking ancestors while meeting current standards for consistency and safety. Craft breweries throughout the region often emphasize traditional ingredients and methods, creating modern versions of ancient ales and meads that connect contemporary drinkers to their cultural heritage without requiring them to risk the health consequences associated with medieval brewing practices. Business culture in modern Scandinavia has adapted traditional drinking customs to professional contexts, creating elaborate entertainment traditions that use alcohol to build business relationships while maintaining the professional standards required for international commerce. The ability to drink seriously while conducting successful business negotiations represents a sophisticated evolution of the political drinking that once characterized Viking diplomacy. The educational systems in Scandinavian countries have developed comprehensive approaches to alcohol education that combine historical awareness with practical harm reduction, teaching young people to understand both their cultural heritage and the responsibilities associated with their drinking traditions. This educational approach produces adults who can participate in traditional drinking customs while making informed decisions about their personal alcohol consumption. Gender equality in modern Scandinavian drinking culture represents a significant evolution from Viking traditions, as women now participate fully in drinking customs that were historically dominated by male warriors. This inclusion has created more balanced social dynamics, while preserving the community-building functions that made Viking drinking culture socially valuable despite its obvious risks. The integration of Scandinavian drinking traditions with international business and diplomatic customs has created hybrid systems that allow modern Nordic countries to maintain their cultural identity while participating successfully in global economic and political systems. The ability to honor traditional toasting customs while conducting business with international partners demonstrates the adaptability of cultural traditions when they serve important social functions. Health consciousness in modern Scandinavia has influenced traditional drinking customs without completely eliminating them, creating modified versions that preserve social and cultural benefits while reducing health risks. Contemporary Scandinavians are more likely to drink high-quality beverages in moderate quantities rather than consuming large amounts of whatever alcohol was available, reflecting both increased health awareness and improved economic conditions that make quality more important than quantity. The persistence of storytelling traditions in modern Scandinavian drinking culture maintains the educational and entertainment functions that made Viking drinking gatherings important cultural institutions. While contemporary stories are more likely to focus on personal experience and humor rather than heroic deeds and religious mythology, the underlying tradition of using shared drinking experiences to transmit cultural knowledge and strengthen social bonds remains intact. Tourism industry marketing throughout Scandinavia often emphasizes traditional drinking customs as authentic cultural experiences, creating economic incentives for preserving modified versions of ancient traditions. This commercialization has helped maintain awareness of Viking drinking heritage while adapting it to contemporary safety standards and social expectations. In the end, the transformation of Viking drinking culture into its modern Scandinavian descendant represents one of history's most successful examples of cultural evolution, the ability of a society to preserve the beneficial aspects of potentially dangerous traditions while eliminating the elements that threatened long-term survival and prosperity. The Vikings created a drinking culture that was magnificent, powerful, and ultimately unsustainable. Their descendants created a drinking culture that is moderate, responsible, and remarkably effective at building the kind of social cohesion that makes modern Nordic societies among the most successful and contented in the world. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation is that it occurred gradually, through millions of individual decisions, to modify traditional behaviors, rather than through dramatic revolutionary change or authoritarian prohibition. The Vikings didn't abandon their drinking culture, they evolved it, proving that even the most entrenched cultural traditions can adapt to changing circumstances when the underlying social functions they serve remain valuable and the community possesses the wisdom to distinguish between essential traditions and obsolete practices. The legacy suggests that cultures, like individuals, they can learn from their mistakes while preserving their essential character, a lesson that resonates far beyond the specific context of Scandinavian alcohol customs and offers hope for any society struggling to balance tradition with adaptation in an ever-changing world.